Chapter 2879. Looks like I'm really not suitable for advancing. In the end, the puzzled world founders came to such a conclusion. These world creators were easily satisfied and did not have much initiative in the first place. If that wasn't the case, why would they be so calm when so many founders of this world were tempted to explore that world? It was as if it had nothing to do with them. Clearly, the performance of the other world founders at this time had once again proven the dangers of advancing, but it made them further firmer in their belief. Safety first. There were not many worlds left in the transportation network layer, and there were at most tens of thousands of them. These worlds themselves were distributed in such a devastated transportation network layer, but they seemed a little lonely. Although these world founders believed in the concept of safety first, it was not because their senses were distorted. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine what they were thinking in the face of the devastated transportation network layer. Perhaps we should get rid of them all. At this moment, such a thought emerged in the minds of the remaining world founders. These world founders naturally communicated with each other. Even if they did not have much friendship before this, at this moment, when they were the only ones left in the entire transportation network layer, they would definitely unknowingly establish extremely deep friendship. In this way, they naturally agreed with each other very quickly. Removing the original world pioneers from the transport network layer had shrunk the scale of the transport network layer but made it complete, making them feel comfortable. This was clearly a good thing for all the world pioneers who still existed in the transport network layer. However, it was obviously not difficult to remove the positions of the world founders. And this was because the transportation network layer had already passed the layer tribulation, and as the creator of the transportation network layer, Luofan, had already disappeared in the transportation network layer along with the world of laws. Without these two prerequisites, it would not be difficult, but impossible, to remove the positions of the pioneers of the world. At this moment, the world founders that still remained discussed with each other and worked hard to study the characteristics of the transportation network layer that still remained, trying their best to remove the vacancies left by them. The progress was so slow that it could even be said that it would take 1 trillion years for them to succeed. If this had happened to the other world founders, they might have given up on it. After all, it was just changing the scene of the traffic network layer. There was no real benefit to them at all. Spending billions of trillions of years on something like this was obviously not worth it. However, it was clear that this was only the opinion of the other world founders. For the world founders who prioritized safety above all else, such a safe and predictable goal could not be more perfect. Not to mention billions of trillion years, even if it was millions of times longer, they would still gladly accept it with their efforts. The entire transportation network layer seemed to be trembling slightly. In this trembling, all the roads in the transportation network layer were slightly distorted. Among them, the most intense tremors came from the ruptures of the node. That is, the original location of those worlds that were separated from the transportation network layer. Of course, the tremors and distortions were not intense. At this rate, it would take billions of years for the tremors and distortions to completely mend the gaps while the remaining pioneers in the transportation network layer were working hard to get rid of the other pioneers. The other pioneers in the great world formed by the tribulation layer were looking around blankly. They were looking at the world that was rather familiar to them, or rather, the island. The reason why this world was rather familiar was very simple. It was because many of them had sent their clones into the world of laws. Although they eventually gave up on the clones they had sent into it, it was clear that before they gave up on the clones, they were still connected to the clones. Everything that the clones had experienced and seen was like what they had experienced and seen themselves. As for the world in front of them, it gave them the feeling that it was similar to the world that the incarnation had experienced in the law world. Perhaps it was more complete than the world that their clones had experienced back then? It was precisely because of this situation that this part of the world felt both familiar and foreign to them, Was everything we experienced before just an illusion? Some world founders murmured blankly. At this moment, they were a little doubtful if everything they had experienced was an illusion. Could it be that he had not explored that great world, but his senses had been distorted by the world of laws? In the end, he took the initiative to send his true body into the world of laws, turning himself into a fish on the chopping board? No, no one can do this and distort all of our senses, a world founder retorted when he heard this. His rebuttal was sonorous and forceful, but his heart was clearly not as firm as he appeared to be. This rebuttal was more to strengthen his confidence so that he would not be devoured by this terrifying possibility. This place isn't that world. At least, it's not the world that we have seen before. Suddenly, another world founder spoke. His words made most of the world progenitors look at him uncontrollably. Being stared at by so many world founders, the world founder could not help but feel an inexplicable pressure surging from the bottom of his heart. One must know that he did not have his own world now, and his current state was completely like his true body had descended. Most of the other world founders were not inferior to him. Under such circumstances, as long as he said something wrong and offended 1 in 10,000th of the world's founders, they would want to erase him. If that happened, the outcome that awaited him would not be pretty. With such pressure, unless the world founders completely disregarded life and death, it was impossible for there to be no abnormalities. However, since he had already said it, it was impossible for him to take back half of the words that he had said. At this moment, he just smiled faintly and said, "Don't you guys feel it? There are no parallel worlds in this world." Hearing this, many world founders were slightly stunned, and then their eyes lit up one after another. One must know that the original clones of many world founders had come into contact with the parallel worlds of laws. This also meant that the real world of laws should have a considerable number of parallel worlds. However, now that they were here, they did not feel any signs of the existence of parallel worlds at all. It was as if this world of laws was only what they saw in their eyes, and this was originally where the main body of the world of laws was. This situation either meant that the world of law had fallen back to the level of their world, or that this wasn't the world that they knew of. Obviously, if they were to believe that the world of laws would fall and degenerate again, they would be more willing to believe that this was no longer the world they knew. After all, if the world was going to degenerate, they could not imagine what kind of blow the world founders had to suffer for them to appear. If the creator of the world had suffered such a heavy blow, how could they still be here? "I also don't feel any traces of my clones," one of the world founders murmured. At this moment, the other world founders were also carefully sensing, looking for traces of their clones in this world of laws. One must know that the clones that they had abandoned had completely integrated into this world of laws, completely transforming into some kind of inseparable law, or perhaps law, in the world of laws. Under such circumstances, as long as this world was a world of laws, the traces that belonged to their clones would definitely exist. Even if the traces would be very different from their original clones, they would still exist. No matter how much they changed, there would still be traces of familiarity. But now, these world founders did not sense any traces of their clones at all. Was there a need to say what this meant? While the founders were carefully searching for their location, one of them suddenly cried out in surprise. "You're actually here." His voice was filled with anger, but there was also the joy of revenge. His words made the other world founders extend their senses in that direction. Very soon, furious and excited roars rang out one after another. "I've finally caught you." Many world founders gradually discovered the target that caused that existence to have such complicated emotions. That target was none other than a figure that they were extremely familiar with, but now seemed to have turned into a statue. It was the figure of a perfect world founder. Clearly, the range of the world founders was too wide, and in the end, one of them happened to be near the perfect world founder. Then, when he probed the surroundings, he discovered the existence of the perfect world founder. For these world founders who had been schemed against by the perfect world founder and unknowingly fell into this familiar yet unfamiliar world, it was naturally self-evident how they would react when they saw the perfect world founder. Not long after, several figures appeared near the creator of the perfect world, and gazes filled with anger and hatred focused on the creator of the perfect world. Although they all wanted to tear the perfect world founder into pieces, these world founders had just been schemed against by the perfect world founder, so they naturally wouldn't act so rashly. At that moment, they surrounded the creator of the perfect world and carefully examined his situation. They wanted to know if this statue-like existence before them was really the creator of the perfect world and what his current situation was. They also wanted to know if attacking him would bring any danger to themselves. For the first point, it was not difficult for the world founders to determine if this statue-like figure was the perfect world founder. In fact, the performance of the first world founder who discovered the statue had already proved his judgment. However, for the second point, none of the world founders could be sure. At this moment, the perfect world founder's performance was simply too strange. He clearly had vitality, and his presence was clearly the same as before. However, they were unable to move at all. It was as if they had already merged with the world and turned into some sort of natural landscape. No matter what method they used to sense it, they could not find any flaws, nor could they sense any traces of the circulation of power. Under such circumstances, none of them dared to act rashly at this moment. "Looks like he's met with retribution," one of the world founders suddenly said, then turned around and left. Evidently, this was a world founder who believed that this state of the perfect world founder was the greatest punishment for him, and there was no need for him to continue attacking him. Following the actions of the world's founder, the other world's founders also split up. Some felt that they were not confident, some felt that this was already enough punishment like the world's founder, and some simply dispelled their hatred towards him. They immediately turned around and left one after another. In the blink of an eye, the number of world founders around the perfect world founder was reduced by a small half. The remaining world founders were clearly unwilling to give up. They still wanted to understand the situation of the perfect world founder before imposing further punishment on him. At this moment, above the void, at the boundary between the island and the suppressive force, the previous incarnation saw everything and had an indescribable look of admiration on his face. What he was admiring was naturally the many world founders who decisively left the perfect world founder. Chapter 2880. The flow of time in this world was completely independent from the flow of time in the other worlds in the simulated primal chaos. Countless years might have passed in the other worlds, but only a few days had passed in this world. Or perhaps only a few days had passed in the other worlds, but millions of years had passed in this world. It was even possible that a period of time had passed in this world, and the flow of time in the other worlds in the simulated primal chaos had even returned to the past due to this relatively independent characteristic. No matter how long this world had experienced, it had no connection to how long the cause of the changes had been brewing. In other words, to this world, the changes were happening at the same time, but to the worlds that had caused the changes, their flow of time might be extremely unsynchronized, and the time interval might even be hundreds of millions of years. It was just like the results of the various tests that had appeared in this world at the same time appeared in a short period of time. It was also as if the indescribable existences that had smashed into this world like raindrops. At this moment, countless mysterious existences smashed into this world in various ways. They were like shooting stars, undercurrents at the bottom of the sea, phantoms, or some kind of subtle distortion in time and space, or traces of strange living beings, or the shadows of certain islands, and so on and so forth. There were all sorts of strange things that were almost beyond the imagination of living beings. These existences entered this world in different ways, but for this world, the flow of time was almost synchronized, and their fates were almost the same. All existences that entered this world were completely devoured and fused with this world, making this world even more mysterious and wondrous. This world, which had originally been a boundless ocean, was now densely packed with hundreds of millions of islands that could no longer be ignored. Every single one of these islands was insignificant compared to this world. In terms of size, they could almost be completely ignored. However, it was just like a black dot on a piece of white paper. If it was just a single black dot, it would naturally be easy to ignore. However, once the number of black dots increased to a certain extent, then this piece of white paper could no longer be called a piece of white paper. Instead, it would become a piece of dusty paper. At this moment, the countless densely packed islands that appeared in this world were like black dots on that piece of white paper. Because there were simply too many of them, in the end, they completely changed the appearance of this world. At this moment, compared to the former incarnation and the other creators from the transportation network layer, who only paid attention to the situation inside this world that was suspected of being a perfect world of laws, or rather, their perspective could only be limited to the interior of this world that was suspected of being a perfect world of laws, Luo Fan, who was the creator of the world of laws, directly looked at the overall situation. He had never set his sights on individual islands, or rather, on individual worlds. From the very beginning, he had set his sights on the entire world as a whole. At this moment, the changes that had occurred in this world were naturally seen by him. After seeing this clearly, he already had some other guesses about the reason why the numerous existences with different forms appeared at the same time that smashed into this world just now. Perhaps it's because they are all equally powerless to this world, so they appeared at the same time. Those changes with different manifestations, even if they start at the same time, will not appear in this world at the same time, but will choose another time. At this time, such a thought flashed in Luofan's mind. For a moment, he had a better understanding of this world. This world was formed by the tribulation layer, and the one guiding this transformation was the incarnation of the will that was suspected to be the tribulation layer or the state of chaos. Only such an incarnation of the will could cause such an incredible change in the entire tribulation layer, transforming it from a state where the power of the tribulations wreaked havoc into an incomparably vast and great world. And the fundamental purpose of creating such a world was obviously to deal with him. Or to be more specific, it was to deal with the three-legged cauldron that he had condensed with the help of the power related to the true sage. At this moment, the suppression power released by his three-legged cauldron was still almost absolute relative to the surrounding world, and it could completely suppress all changes in this world within its scope of effect. Even the boundless terrifying waves in the outside world would be suppressed at the same time after entering a certain range, causing all destructive power to disappear. However, this range could only be limited to the surroundings of the world that was suspected to be a perfect world of laws at this moment. In other words, it was limited to the surroundings of the island that was the source of all the turbulence and rejection in this world. Within this range, the three-legged cauldron's power was indeed almost absolute, and it was enough for Luo Fan to obtain the greatest victory. However, all of these victories were only limited to this extremely small area compared to this part of the world. Outside this range, in the boundless world, everything was still under the absolute control of the incarnation of the will. Now, the various changes in this world, and even the various results caused by the incarnation of the perfect world, could be said to be the result of the incarnation of the will. In other words, it could be said that the island he was on, or rather, the world he was on, had transformed into a world of perfect laws, and it could be said to have been indirectly caused by the incarnation of the will. Everything, including the growth of the island itself, the transformation from a perfect state that had been distorted by the worldview of laws to its current state, where it seemed to have grown tremendously and even integrated with the many creators of the world, and so on and so forth, all the changes that seemed to be of great benefit to the island were the indirect results of the incarnation of the will. Luo Fan still didn't know the purpose of the incarnation of the will, but he knew that the incarnation of the will was definitely not an existence that did good deeds without leaving its name. This was especially so when he was already standing on the opposite side. The changes that seemed to have many benefits to him must have hidden dangers, or it might even be a trap. It was precisely because of this that he did not allow this world to evolve at this moment. He did not directly let the world founders, the perfect world founders, or even the various resources brought by the incarnation of the will to truly transform into the potential of his island. Instead, he let the three-legged cauldron that was formed by the power related to the true divine cover the entire world, and at the same time, this world was also under the suppression of that power. Of course, this was his own world after all, and it was closely related to him, so the suppression method was naturally different from the suppression method he used on other things. Therefore, although the living beings in this world were suppressed, he did not feel too much, and it was as if all their activities were not suppressed. At this moment, the various situations in this world made him feel like a storm was brewing, as if the incarnation of the will was brewing a huge move against him. However, although he could confront the incarnation of the will with the help of the three-legged cauldron, preventing the incarnation of the will from directly interfering with the island he was on, and even if it wanted to accomplish something, it could only rely on indirect method. After all, it was only relying on the three-legged cauldron. Moreover, the real power that exerted its power was the power related to the true divine. Although the three-legged cauldron could release an unimaginable supreme suppression power due to its structure, in fact, the power that belonged to the power related to the true divine was only an insignificant part of it. This way of using that power could only be regarded as a crude way of using it. In fact, it could not even be considered as truly flexible use of the power related to the true divine. Under such circumstances, he was now facing the incarnation of the will that could change the entire tribulation level at will, and even indirectly mobilize the power of the entire simulated state of chaos. How many other ways could he have? One side could use the power of the simulated state of chaos at will, while the other side could not even mobilize the power that it relied on. It was already self-evident who was stronger and who was weaker in the confrontation between the two. At this moment, although Luo Fan could feel the atmosphere of the storm, there was nothing he could do, and he could only wait for everything to happen vigilantly. Of course, he had the most fundamental way to break out of this predicament, and that was to strengthen his control of the power related to the true divine. If he could control that power perfectly, it would be a piece of cake for him to break out of this simulated state of chaos and completely transcend. At that time, it would be equivalent to him surviving the seventh Great Tribulation. However, it was obvious that he would not be able to do this even if he advanced a few more realms and reached the level of a 9 Tribulations powerhouse. After all, that was a power related to the true divine. Such a power itself contained a certain mystery related to the true divine. If not, it would not be able to face the simulated state of chaos that was countless times larger than it. The mystery related to the true divine was obviously not something that could be fully understood by those who had not reached the true divine level. If one could not understand the mystery of a certain thing, it would simply be a fool's dream to want to completely control that thing. Therefore, if one worked hard in this direction, it could be said that one was destined to fail. Lamenting in his heart, Luo Fan shifted the gaze of his incarnation from the entire world outside to the special area in the center of the island. From the perspective of an island, this core region was naturally located at the center of the island, the core of the core. Still, if one were to look at it from the perspective of the world, the core region was hidden in layers of dimensions, parallel time, parallel space, and even a certain bizarre dimension where everything else was located in the depths of the universe. That's right, although the creators of the world believed that there were no more parallel universes in this world and believed that there were no traces of their incarnations here, in fact, that was only because they were suppressed by the three-legged cauldron. In fact, all the parallel universes still existed in this world. In fact, because of the existence of that perfect quality, the connection between him and the main body of this world became even closer and more mysterious. In that core area, his main body, along with the power related to the true divine, seemed to have existed since time immemorial, quietly waiting there. At this moment, his main body also opened his eyes and looked at the incarnation, directly connecting with the eyes of the incarnation. For a moment, an unknown amount of information was exchanged between the main body and the incarnation through this gaze. It must be known that this incarnation had always been Luo Fan's incarnation and had always had a close connection with him. However, in fact, this incarnation and the main body were still separated by the power related to the true divine, and were even separated by countless space-time and countless possibilities. Under such circumstances, the information exchange between the main body and the incarnation would ultimately be somewhat disrupted. This interference would not allow the incarnation to become independent, but it would cause the thoughts of the incarnation, the will of the incarnation, the information that the incarnation received, and the new information that was born in the depths of the incarnation's heart to be unable to be transmitted to the main body in absolute synchronization. Similarly, the various comprehensions, experiences, and improvements of the main body could not be transmitted to the incarnation at the same time. As a result, the strange exchange of information between the clone and the main body became necessary at this moment. There's actually such a huge difference. After this exchange, the main body and the incarnation had the same thought at the same time. Through this exchange, both of them confirmed one thing at the same time, and that was, the difference in thinking between the main body and the incarnation was actually much greater than he had imagined. Chapter 2881. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan instantly came to a realization. This must be one of the reasons why the incarnation of the will had done so many things before. To think that it would use such a method. It's indeed not easy to deal with, he thought to himself as he became even more wary of the incarnation of the will. Cutting off the connection between his main body and his clone was clearly an effective way to bypass the suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. After all, if this kind of separation continued, there would come a day when the connection between his original body and his avatar would be completely severed. At that time, this avatar, which was entrusted with the power related to a true divine, would naturally stand on the opposite side of his original body. In other words, he would stand on the side of the incarnation of the will. In that case, the three-legged cauldron would no longer be a threat to the incarnation of the will, and it would become a force on his side. Once this happened, the existence that was currently protecting Luo Fan would naturally turn around and attack Luo Fan. In that case, the confrontation between Luo Fan and the incarnation of the will would naturally collapse on its own. As expected, I can't even relax for a moment. After a while, Luo Fan sighed with emotion again. He tried his best to strengthen the connection between his main body and his doppelganger. He tried his best to eliminate the barrier between his main body and his doppelganger that had appeared because of the changes that had occurred on this island. If he did not discover this barrier, it would naturally continue to grow, and in the end, it would completely sever the connection between his main body and his clone, allowing his clone to gain independence. However, once he discovered the existence of this barrier, it would no longer be a problem for him. Currently, he could already re-establish a connection just by looking at his main body and his clone, and bypass the barrier that was constantly growing stronger. Moreover, this was just a method of communication that he had casually constructed. For Luo Fan, if he wanted to, he could establish a method of communication that was countless times more exquisite than the one he had imagined, and connect his main body with his clone. At this moment, with a thought, various indescribable undulations were inserted into the power related to the true divine. With the help of the connection between the power related to the true divine, he transmitted the undulations to his clone and established an almost unbreakable undulation connection with his clone. With the establishment of this connection, the connection between his main body and his clone was greatly strengthened. In the blink of an eye, his main body and his clone had already fused into one again, and the invisible barrier between them had been completely broken. Sensing that the extremely close connection had been re-established, Luo Fan slightly breathed a sigh of relief. Of course, it was only slightly. Although he had already strengthened the connection between his main body and his avatar, he knew very well that cutting off the connection between his main body and his avatar was definitely not the only reason for the avatar's will to cause the various changes on this island. As the will incarnation that was suspected to simulate the state of chaos, it was at least an existence at the tribulation level. How could the will incarnation's methods be so simple? To him, any action would definitely have a sufficiently deep meaning, and any action would definitely lead to a large number of results that were beneficial to him. Isolating the connection between the clone and the main body seemed to be heaven-defying enough, but if it was used on the incarnation of the will, this reason seemed a little weak. Therefore, it was inevitable that it would have a deeper plan to cause all these changes. If he ignored it, it would definitely lead to even more serious consequences. At this time, Luo Fan was extremely vigilant in his heart. He carefully examined himself from top to bottom, inside and outside, probing the various subtle connections between himself and the island, as well as the various changes that had taken place on the island and the development trend in the future. The incarnation of the will would definitely have a deeper intention and more plans. However, judging from the direction of the plan to cut off the connection between his main body and his clone, the incarnation of the will was probably targeting the interior of the three-legged cauldron's suppressive power. After all, compared to the battle within the suppressive power, it was much more difficult to break through the protection of the three-legged cauldron's suppressive power and attack the existence within it from the outside. In the face of such a situation, the many other plans of the incarnation of the will were most likely aimed at the various existences within the suppressive power. Even at this moment, Luo Fan did not know what the direction of the incarnation of the will was, nor did he know what effect it wanted to achieve in the end. However, it was obviously not wrong to be vigilant. At this moment, the power related to the true saint was still the same as before, and it did not respond to any changes in the outside world. It was like an eternally motionless dead object, completely ignoring all changes in the outside world. It was as if all the changes in the outside world were insignificant to it. At this moment, there seemed to be no difference between the core of the perfect world of laws, the core of the perfect world of laws, and even the depths of the tribulation level. At this moment, the perception of Luo Fan's main body was still dragged into the power, and it was still outlined in an extremely complicated formation within the power. It was tightly locked with the power, and it could not be shaken at all, let alone escape. From a certain point of view, this kind of locking could also be considered a kind of protection. After all, the perception was locked with the power related to the true saint. In that case, if he wanted to destroy the perception, he would first have to destroy the power that was locking onto the perception. At the very least, he would have to separate the perception from the power related to the true saint. Obviously, either of these two methods was extremely difficult. It was the same for the simulated chaotic state. It could be said that although it was not absolutely impossible, with such a precaution, the safety of Luo Fan's perception was already guaranteed to a considerable extent. For the current Luo Fan, even if his true body was destroyed and completely erased, he would definitely be able to recover in an instant as long as he had this perception. It would be as if he hadn't suffered any injuries and wouldn't be affected in the slightest. With such a guarantee, logically speaking, Luo Fan would be able to provoke the simulated chaotic state without any restrictions, and even let the incarnation of the will carry out all kinds of schemes and plans against him. However, it was obvious that such a negative choice would never happen to Luo Fan. If that was the case, wouldn't he have to exist in his seventh major tribulation forever? Even for him, there was still cultivation and improvement everywhere. There wasn't much difference between cultivating in the simulated chaotic state created by the seventh major tribulation and cultivating in the real chaotic state. However, there was a fatal weakness in the simulated chaotic state created by the seventh major tribulation, which made it impossible for him to stay here forever. That was, if he couldn't survive the seventh major tribulation, he wouldn't be able to trigger the eighth or ninth major tribulation, and he wouldn't be able to become a true saint. Perhaps, in the simulated chaotic state created by the seventh major tribulation, the improvement he could get would be limited. Under such circumstances, he might be able to stay in the simulated chaotic state for a relatively long period of time, like in any other place, such as in the Tao Master's Road, or in the land of opportunities in the chaotic state, or even directly cultivating in a certain chaotic layer. However, that period of time would definitely be limited. Even if this period of time was billions of trillions of years, or even billions of trillions of trillions of trillions of years, it was impossible for this period of time to turn into an eternity. Obviously, once he chose to allow the power related to true saint to protect his perception and his last chance of survival, then he would completely lose the possibility of transcending the simulated chaotic state and getting rid of the seventh major tribulation. And this also meant that even if he could get the best result, he would have to live here for an infinite period of time. Therefore, even with this last guarantee, Luo Fan had never thought of using this guarantee to give up fighting against the incarnation of the will. Moreover, this kind of final guarantee was not too absolute. First of all, the two ways to break it were not absolute. At the level of the simulated chaotic state, it was naturally impossible to completely destroy this power related to true saint. However, who could guarantee that this power related to true saint would never change? Who could guarantee that the power related to the true divine would exist here forever and would not disappear? Perhaps, the power related to the true divine would suddenly disappear without a trace. Although the possibility was not high, no one could guarantee that it would not happen. In addition, Luo Fan's perception and the lock of this power were not really unbreakable. At this time, Luo Fan couldn't even describe how mysterious the simulated chaotic state was. Who knew when it would give rise to some kind of change that could dispel his perception and this power's lock? Perhaps this possibility was as small as the previous possibility, but no one could prove that this possibility would not happen. Obviously, it was impossible for Luo Fan to bet his fate on this possibility. Secondly, this power that was related to the true divine was not completely harmless. Perhaps this power related to true saint did not care about Luo Fan at all and could even provide some protection for him through his efforts. However, all of this was obviously not the true intention of that power. This situation was created by Luo Fan through various ingenious means. At most, this power did not resist at all. No one could feel how much kindness it had for Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, who knew when this power would suddenly react and directly attack Luo Fan? Although based on the current state of the power that was related to the true divine, the possibility of this happening was not high. However, it was obvious that this possibility existed. It would be fine if it did not happen, but once it did, wouldn't Luo Fan not be able to cry even if he wanted to? In fact, even now, the second danger still existed. If there was a way, Luo Fan would never be willing to pin his life on the second danger not appearing. However, it was obvious that because of a moment of carelessness, his current perception had been locked with the power related to true saint. Even if he wanted to get rid of it now, he could not. Hence, for the time being, he could only accept this result. At this moment, Luo Fan carefully sensed everything, and everything on the island that was like a perfect world of laws was completely unfolded in his mind. The suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron was unimaginably powerful and mysterious. Under this suppressive force, all the developments on this island were completely under Luo Fan's control. If he wanted it to be stagnant, it could only be stagnant in that state. For example, the many possibilities on the island were currently hovering between existence and non-existence under the suppressive force. This was also the fundamental reason why the creators of the world couldn't discover those possibilities, or rather, the existence of those parallel existences. Otherwise, given the perception abilities of the creators of the world, how could they not sense the existence of their incarnations at all? How could they have made such a wrong judgment before? At this moment, countless possibilities had already unfolded in Luo Fan's mind. The countless possibilities from the beginning to the present, and even the future developments were unreservedly revealed in his mind. There were so many changes involved, and the amount of information involved was so great that it even exceeded the limits of what could be described with numbers. If it weren't for this incomparably mysterious suppressive force suppressing everything, even Luo Fan would have been stunned for a long time because of the countless changes and the endless amount of information. But now, under Luo Fan's will, the information and the endless changes were accepted by him in a way that he could easily bear. This world was the product of the fusion of the perfect characteristic that had been distorted by the world of laws. It could be said that it was also the appearance of the world of laws after it was imitated by the chaotic state and endowed with the perfect characteristic. It wasn't inaccurate to say that it was a perfect world of laws. Chapter 2882. An ordinary perfect world should be a world that had passed through the 7 great tribulations of the heavens and the earth that could naturally descend from the state of chaos. When the world had reached the limit that the world could endure and could no longer advance, only then would it trigger a certain subtle mechanism that simulated the state of chaos. In the end, only then would the characteristic of perfection descend and fuse with the world, causing the world to become a perfect world. A world like this was obviously a world that had gone through 7 great tribulations. At this time, Luo Fan's world was obviously not satisfied with this premise. At the very most, Luo Fan's world of laws was only equivalent to passing 3 great tribulations. Although Luo Fan's worldview was quite mysterious and more perfect than ordinary worldviews, his world of laws wasn't any weaker than an ordinary world of laws that had gone through the 7th great tribulation of the world. It didn't mean that he hadn't gone through the remaining 4 great tribulations. In that case, the 4 huge benefits that could be obtained from the simulated chaos state would naturally no longer exist as a result. Such a deficiency caused the world of laws to actually not reach the strongest realm that it could reach in the simulated state of chaos. In other words, under normal circumstances, if the world of laws continued to develop like a normal world in the simulated state of chaos, then the level it could reach in the end would definitely be higher than what it was now. In that case, once the world of laws naturally obtained the perfect characteristic, not only would the perfect characteristic be incomparably compatible with the world of laws, but the blessing that it would receive would also probably be many times stronger than it was now. Of course, all of this was obviously not something that Luo Fan could choose to do. He had gone from being a normal creator of the world in the transportation network layer to finally standing on the opposite side of the simulated chaos state. Everything was the result of the interaction of many factors. In this way, even if he had known this a long time ago, he would still have been pushed to this step by the situation, of course. Although he wasn't very satisfied with the level of his world of laws at this time, Luo Fan was actually quite clear that this might not be a bad thing. After all, he still had to stand on the opposite side of the simulated chaos state. In the end, he still had to break through the simulated chaos state and complete transcendence. In this case, he would be able to obtain a lot of benefits from the simulated chaos state. Although he didn't see any problems for the time being, it was still a hidden danger. Who knew if there were any back doors or hidden loopholes among the many benefits of simulating the chaotic state? Of course, this did not mean that Luo Fan's previous actions were not dangerous. After all, he had been communicating with the simulated chaos at all times ever since he had stepped into it. His world of laws had also been created from the simulated chaos. Everything he comprehended from the world of laws ultimately came from simulating the state of chaos. In this way, even if he completely abandoned the simulated chaotic state and stepped into the tribulation level to directly comprehend the various secrets of the tribulation level, he still didn't completely get rid of the possibility of backdoors and hidden dangers being planted in the simulated chaotic state. Now, although the world of law didn't absorb the benefits it could obtain from the last 4 great tribulations and didn't directly absorb the perfect characteristics that simulated the state of chaos that naturally targeted the world of law, it still couldn't completely avoid the existence of backdoors and hidden dangers. After all, the world of law had already obtained benefits 3 times, it was just that the more it obtained, the greater the possibility of backdoors and hidden dangers being planted in it. As for how to measure it, it would depend on one's own judgment. For Luo Fan, the current situation wasn't perfect, but it was still barely acceptable. Normally speaking, this kind of perfect characteristic should be safer than before. There must be many backdoors or hidden dangers, and it should be unlikely for them to erupt before the power completely gives up on this perfect characteristic. Luo Fan thought to himself as he secretly sensed the information about the world of laws that flowed into his heart at his extreme speed. Due to the existence of the supreme suppressive force released by the 3-legged cauldron, he could not only choose the speed at which he received the information, but he could also choose the content of the information. Therefore, even though the amount of information was beyond imagination, and it would normally take him hundreds of trillions of years to receive it at such a speed, he was still confident that he could finish receiving the information in an acceptable amount of time. After all, the suppressive force itself was the best information filter. It was enough to filter out unimportant information that had nothing to do with the direction he was concerned about, so as to prevent him from receiving too much useless information. After being filtered by the suppressive force, it still took Luo Fan thousands of years to finish receiving the large amount of information. Of course, with the existence of the suppressive force, this period of time might be less than an instant compared to the time outside the world of laws. After all, this suppressive force could even suppress time, so the flow of time inside the world of laws was naturally completely independent of the flow of time in all other areas. There are a lot more discordant things that shouldn't have appeared. After experiencing it for a while, Luo Fan couldn't help but be surprised and overjoyed. After all, this island, or rather, the world of laws, was formed by the distortion and fusion of the perfect characteristic of the world of laws and another world of laws. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for the world of laws and the perfect characteristic to be perfectly compatible with each other. It was like a ball that was squeezed out of thin air. No matter how dexterous one was, the ball couldn't be a perfect ball. Therefore, the distorted perfect characteristic was naturally somewhat different from the perfect characteristic that the world of laws could obtain from the simulated state of chaos if it developed normally. These differences were where most of the discordant things were. In addition, the perfect characteristic itself was aimed at the world of laws that had undergone 7 great tribulations, while the world of laws itself had only undergone 3 great tribulations. The difference in the number of great tribulations was another source of discordant things. All these discordant things intertwined with each other, and the final result was that there were many discordant things in the world of laws at this moment. Although these discordant areas caused the world of laws to be filled with hidden dangers and greatly increased the danger, it was also a breakthrough point. It was a breakthrough point to deal with the incarnation of the will behind the world of laws. It was precisely because of this that his expression was so strange and complicated at this moment. At this moment, some subtle changes suddenly appeared in the surrounding ocean out of nowhere. This incomparably great world of laws was completely born from the tribulations, and everything in it was formed from the power of the tribulations. At this moment, the origin of the many islands that appeared in this boundless ocean-like world was the world created by the creators of the world. Perhaps it would go through all kinds of distortions, transformations, and even all kinds of incredible changes, but this essence couldn't be changed. Under such circumstances, everything that was originally in this world would naturally reject all the islands, including the island that was suppressed by the power of suppression. In this way, the boundless waves around the island repelled and scoured the surrounding island, which was obviously an incomparably natural phenomenon. But at this moment, when this subtle change appeared, the rejection of the island by the seawater that covered the entire world actually began to weaken unknowingly. It was as if the irreconcilable contradiction between the two had been gradually reconciled. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan immediately felt it. An indescribable vigilance emerged in his heart. He wasn't sure where the incarnation of the will was now. But he knew that everything in this world was now under the absolute control of the incarnation of the will. The sudden weakening of the repelling effect was obviously the result of the incarnation of the will. What was the incarnation of the will going to do now? What the incarnation of the will was going to do now was to deal with him. Under such circumstances, the changes in front of him were obviously dangerous to him that he hadn't discovered yet. Knowing this, how could he not be vigilant? What exactly is it trying to do? At this moment, he raised his head and looked out. His eyes seemed to penetrate the barrier of infinite space and time, and he saw the incarnation of the will hidden in the depths of this world. At this moment, in the perfect world of laws, the many creators of the world had already begun to take action against the creator of the perfect world. It was as if there was an inexplicable impulse that was pushing them to take action. Of course, this impulse was extremely weak. Even the many creators of the world couldn't sense the unnaturalness of the impulse. At most, they felt that it was just a whim. There was no need to mention the means of the founders. Every single one of them was an existence that could create a new world. Their strength was not something that ordinary cultivators could compare to, and the number of means they had was not something that ordinary cultivators could imagine. At this moment, they joined forces. In an instant, the entire perfect world of laws seemed to have become much dimmer, and it seemed as if the world was faintly shaking. There were countless means and all kinds of strange means. Some were brilliance, some were light, some were waves, some were invisible and intangible, and some were simply magic treasures, weapons, and other objects. If ordinary cultivators joined forces like this, it would definitely end up in an uncontrollable mess. However, at this moment, the ones who joined forces to attack were not ordinary cultivators, but the world creators. Even if they didn't agree on how to cooperate, the means they used in the end wouldn't have too much direct conflict with the other world creators. In the end, even if there were all kinds of strange means that seemed to have a strong conflict with each other, there would definitely be some points that were compatible with other means. And the other world creators would definitely be able to grasp these points of compatibility as well. In this way, the various means that should have been extremely chaotic finally gathered together, but it didn't seem chaotic at all. Instead, it was extremely subtle, and there was an inexplicable sense of harmony. These countless methods drowned the perfected heaven and earth creator, who was like a statue. There were countless methods, and some of them were completely ineffective against the perfect world creators. However, with so many methods, even the crudest of them, there would definitely be some that hit the mark and coincided with certain laws, and could be effective against the perfect world creators. Moreover, these means were definitely not crudely used, and every single one of them was indescribably exquisite. At that moment, the perfect creator of the world, who was like a statue, had his defenses broken through by countless means and brazenly penetrated into his body. It began to affect his body from many directions, causing destruction. Crack, crack, a strange sound rang out from the body of the perfect heaven and earth creator. Hearing that sound, many of the world creators rejoiced inwardly. It was clear that the grand perfection world creator could no longer endure the attacks, and was on the verge of collapsing and being destroyed. To the world creators, this was clearly the result that they wanted. However, before the world creators could smile, their expressions changed drastically as they couldn't believe what they were feeling. Soon after, an unimaginable suppressive force appeared from the world creator's body in the blink of an eye. Before the world creators could even react, it had already enveloped them, causing them to be completely stunned. Just like the world creator from before, it was so much so that the countless means that they had released earlier were suppressed along with them. Chapter 2883. At a glance, the surroundings of the region where the creators of perfect worlds had landed had undergone earth-shattering changes. The statues floated in all directions, staring at the special body formed by the creator of the perfect world and the heaven and earth in the center with all kinds of postures and expressions. Between them, an endless amount of strange light and shadows filled almost all the gaps in between. Those lights and shadows were of all shapes and sizes. Perhaps they were unimaginable existences that possessed unimaginable power and unimaginable characteristics. However, at this moment, everything merely turned into some sort of strange light and shadow. The only difference between them was the color and shape. At this moment, the world creators who had already left this region shuddered as an intense lingering fear surged from the depths of their hearts. Indeed, attacking him is simply courting death. I almost ended up like him. Such thoughts kept appearing in the hearts of the world creators. As for why they thought that they almost ended up like him, it was naturally because although they had decided to leave that region and not attack the creators of perfect worlds, it was actually just a change of heart. In other words, it was because the moment they made the decision, their thoughts were inclined to leave and no longer cared about their previous enmity. They had to consider their own safety first. In fact, the difference between the hearts of the other world creators who had stayed behind and them was actually just that their thoughts were inclined in another direction at that moment. In this way, the difference between their safety and that of the world's founders who had been turned into statues was self-evident. How could they not feel lingering fear when they realized how insignificant the difference was? After the lingering fear, they walked even faster. Although they had managed to avoid this crisis, who knew what other dangers were waiting for them? Perhaps another crisis would arrive soon. They were lucky to avoid misfortune this time, but the same could not be said for the next time. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was under the suppression of the three-legged cauldron, slightly furrowed his brows. He sensed that there seemed to be some tiny impurities seeping into the suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. This feeling was rather mystical. The power of suppression was originally an incomparably pure existence that repelled everything. After it appeared this time, it had the support of the power related to the true sage from the source, so its power had reached an unbelievable level. Normally speaking, any existence that triggered the suppression of this suppressive force, unless it could not be suppressed at all, would not be able to have any effect on it. He would definitely be completely suppressed and even fall into the hands of Luo Fan. However, at this moment there was actually some sort of subtle impurity being born within this suppressive power. It was as if some sort of external power was mixing into this suppressive power and was trying to break the purity of this suppressive power. This situation made Luo Fan quite vigilant. With a thought, many changes related to this suppressive force unfolded in his mind. Very quickly, he grasped any changes that happened to the suppressive force before and after the impurities appeared. It's actually you guys. At this moment, he locked his gaze on the many heaven and earth founders from the transportation network layer that existed in the perfect realm of laws. The impurities were born just now when these heaven and earth founders triggered the suppressive force of the perfect realm of laws and were completely suppressed by this suppressive force. Before they were completely suppressed by the suppressive force, the impurities did not appear. After the suppressive force completely suppressed them, the impurities appeared. In this way, there was no need to say what caused the impurities. With a thought, Luo Fan's perception instantly penetrated the bodies and minds of the many heaven and earth founders and began to sense the situation inside and outside of them. He wanted to know what changes had happened to these heaven and earth founders during this process, as well as what kind of reaction was acting on the suppressive force. There were simply too many heaven and earth founders being suppressed. Even if a small number of heaven and earth founders had escaped due to caution and did not make a move against the perfect realm of laws, the number of heaven and earth founders that remained there was still in the hundreds of millions. These heaven and earth founders needed to be counted in the hundreds of millions, and each of them was an existence that could split heaven and earth apart. Moreover, even the heaven and earth that they had opened up had been integrated into the perfect realm of laws in various incredible ways. In this way, the things that these heaven and earth founders represented were obviously grand and vast beyond imagination. At the very least, it was definitely not just these heaven and earth founders themselves, so that's how it is, they're heaven and earth. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly came to a realization and became even more vigilant through his research and understanding of the various conditions of these heaven and earth founders. He had discovered many things that he had overlooked before. Among them, what he should have paid the most attention to was the location of the heaven and earth founders' heaven and earth. Originally, he didn't pay much attention to the heaven and earth founders' heaven and earth. After all, the perfect realm of laws that he had opened up was now far superior to all the heaven and earth in the transportation network layer. In fact, even the perfect realm of laws that simulated the state of chaos actually did not have much of an advantage over his realm of laws. Under such circumstances, he naturally didn't care too much about the final outcome of the heaven and earth that the heaven and earth founders had brought about. At most, he thought that those heaven and earth had been completely crushed and integrated into his realm of laws, just like what he had roughly sensed before. In other words, they had become bricks and tiles for this island. Moreover, according to the current situation of this realm of laws, this situation seemed to be natural. The realm of laws itself had the characteristic of being forcibly distorted into a perfect world that matched the characteristics of the realm of laws, allowing its level to step into the level of a perfect world. However, compared to a normal perfect world, this world lacked the benefits of 4 great world tribulations. In this way, it could be seen that this realm of laws was clearly in a rather empty state at this time. This kind of emptiness would naturally make one's acceptance of external power and essence much stronger. In this way, the integration of the essence and power of the heaven and earth was naturally a matter of course. This was what Luo Fan felt before. But, obviously, this feeling is obviously wrong. At the very least, based on his current understanding, it was wrong. At this moment, although a large part of the essence and power had already integrated into the realm of laws, adding bricks and tiles for the completion, strengthening, and sublimation of the realm of laws, there was still a very core and extremely stubborn small part that remained intact and existed somewhere in the realm of laws. However, there was still an extremely core and stubborn small part that maintained a complete state somewhere in the world of laws. This part of the essence and power naturally still had a subtle connection with the realm of laws. They provided the creators of heaven and earth with an essence and power that surpassed that of ordinary cultivators. And the realm of laws maintained the integrity of the realm of laws through this connection, preventing the essence and power from being completely shattered, devoured, and assimilated by the realm of laws. Of course, this connection was extremely subtle and obscure. If Luo Fan hadn't started from the minds and bodies of the realm of laws and comprehended this connection from the depths of their bodies and minds, He might not have discovered this connection at all in the past. That connection had been beneficial to both the creator of the world and the world itself. It had made both of them more powerful, and made them more resilient to negative effects. But at this moment, when the suppressive power affected the creators of the world, this connection was like a talisman that hastened their deaths. That kind of suppressive power could even be transmitted through a gaze. How could such a close connection not be affected? The moment the creators of the world were suppressed, the suppressive force passed through these connections to the essence and power that still retained their original characteristics, suppressing them at the same time. In other words, in that instant, it seemed like the world founders were suppressed by the suppressive power and turned into statues. However, in reality, how could the creators of heaven and earth be the only ones who were suppressed by the suppressive force? At the same time, the number of existences suppressed along with them corresponded to those who had opened up the world, but their scale was countless times greater than those who had opened up the world. Those essence and power were the essence and power of the world itself. In terms of level, such existences were actually incomparable to those who had opened up the world. After all, the creators of the world had obtained sublimation and power from the world, but their size was much smaller than that of the world. Such existences were naturally of a higher level than a portion of the world. Perhaps not much, but the difference in height was definitely there. Under such circumstances, the essence and power were still able to provide support to the creators of the world, allowing their power and essence to surpass that of ordinary cultivators. This naturally showed that the essence and power were far greater than those who had opened up the world. The result of this was that, during this process, the suppressed existences hidden in the depths of the void, hidden outside of Luo Fan's field of vision, would be many times more suppressed existences than what Luo Fan could see. This kind of unrecognized suppression was constantly having a subtle reaction against the suppressive force. This reaction was constantly accumulating towards the suppressive force and gradually affected the operation of the suppressive force. This caused the way the suppressive force operated to gradually deviate from Luo Fan's understanding. And this change, in Luo Fan's opinion, was that there were some impurities in the suppressive force. The changes that he couldn't understand and control were naturally impurities. As he realized this, the three-legged round cauldron that he was carrying shuddered slightly, and the suppressive power that had been released to completely suppress the entire island, or rather, the entire perfect world of laws, underwent a subtle adjustment in that instant. Under this adjustment, the feeling of impurities began to gradually reduce. And just when Luo Fan thought that this reduction would completely restore his expectations, that was, the feeling of purity without any impurities at the beginning, the reduction stopped after reaching a certain limit. In terms of the amount of impurities, it meant that the impurities had been reduced a lot, but in the end, there was still a portion of impurities that refused to disperse and couldn't be removed no matter what. Luo Fan couldn't be clearer about what this meant. This meant that there were still some existences that he hadn't discovered even now that were suppressed by the suppressive force. It also meant that there were existences that he still hadn't discovered and couldn't understand in his world of laws. So that's how it is. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression turned solemn. This situation seemed to be a trivial matter. After all, it was just a trace of impurities in the suppressive force. Compared to the size of the suppressive force itself, this was extremely insignificant. He could even use the suppressive force to forcibly erase these impurities. However, the meaning behind this wasn't something that could be expressed by these impurities. His control over his world of laws had unknowingly been reduced, and there were actually existences that he couldn't discover and couldn't understand. This was almost equivalent to someone unknowingly planting some kind of device in his body that he couldn't understand. Was there a need to say more about how dangerous it was? Is this what you're doing? Luo Fan raised his head and looked at the sky. His eyes seemed to penetrate endless barriers and see the incarnation of the will that existed in the depths of the sky and space-time. Chapter 2884. The voice sounded illusory, and even Luo Fan couldn't be sure if it was an illusion or if he had really heard such a voice. However, at this moment, he could only eliminate all these distracting thoughts and begin to sense the island below, as well as the supreme suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. The problem now was with his world of laws, and what discovered the problem was the suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. In this case, if he wanted to figure out what the problem was and why there was such a change, the best way was naturally to start from both directions at the same time and finally approach his target. To Luo Fan, the world of laws was almost like his own body, so he naturally had a deep understanding of it. At this moment, as he continued to sense it, the many details and mysteries of this world began to surface in his heart bit by bit. However, since he hadn't sensed the existence that he didn't know about before, he naturally couldn't reveal its true appearance in front of him so easily. Therefore, for the time being, he was experiencing the details and mysteries of this world, but he still did not find the target that he wanted to find. At most, he could only feel that this world had become more perfect, more complete, more balanced, and more harmonious than before after fusing with the characteristics of perfection after the distortion. As for the source of the impurities that caused the suppressive force, he couldn't find it at all. This was the case for the world of laws, but the situation was even more serious for the suppressive force. The source of the suppressive force was the three-legged cauldron. Although all the details of the three-legged cauldron were constructed by Luo Fan according to his own memory and understanding, and there were no secrets about its structure to him. However, its essence was the power that was related to a true divine. This essence made this power an unreachable supreme existence in front of Luo Fan. Even though he was now able to use some of the power of this power, he was still completely clueless about the deep secrets of this power. The result of this uncertainty was that whatever he knew about this power before, he already knew about it. Whatever he didn't know about before, he would never know about it again. Under such circumstances, if he tried his best to study the suppressive power and find the source of the impurities in the suppressive power, one could imagine how much he would gain. It could be said that there was almost no harvest at all. Even if he occasionally had a burst of inspiration and some subtle senses that seemed to reduce the range of impurities, it was only because of the research results of the perfect world of laws and not because of the in-depth sensing of the suppressive force. At this moment, Luo Fan had already expected such a change. However, he did not show any unusual reaction because of it. He merely worked harder to experience, comprehend, and research. After all, the impurities hadn't caused any serious consequences yet. However, if he didn't pay attention to it and allowed it to exist, it would definitely cause serious consequences in the future. Under such circumstances, even if he knew it was difficult, he still had to find the impurities. It would be best if he could completely remove them. While Luo Fan was carefully comprehending and studying, the former incarnation of the creator of the perfect world of laws and realms vaguely felt that something was amiss. For this former incarnation, Luo Fan's position in his heart had reached an extremely high level. It could be said that if there was one existence in this chaotic simulation that could convince him wholeheartedly, it would definitely be Luo Fan. However, at this moment, he suddenly faintly felt an inexplicable feeling emerging from the depths of his heart out of nowhere. It was as if the originally incomparably tall and stalwart Luo Fan seemed to have become less tall and stalwart. Has my heart changed? Have I sobered up, or is there some external force driving my heart to distort? The former incarnation immediately felt the abnormality in his heart, and his expression couldn't help but change slightly. For him, Luo Fan's incomparably powerful and majestic point was still very clear in his heart. Everything had not changed in the slightest compared to before. However, under such circumstances, His feelings for Luo Fan had actually changed. It was as if his heart had suddenly become distorted for no reason. How could he not be vigilant in such a situation? Of course, it was also because this former incarnation was extremely concerned about his own self and was constantly on guard that he reacted so quickly. After all, to this former incarnation, his origin was just an independent incarnation of the creator of the perfect world of laws and realms. With such an origin, his own self naturally struggled out of the illusion with great difficulty. It could almost be said that he was born because of a miracle. The rarity of this was self-evident. Any existence would obviously have such a mentality. The more difficult it was to obtain something, the more they would pay attention to it. It was the same for this former incarnation. To him, the most difficult thing to obtain was obviously his own self. Is it distortion? Could this be the means of his enemy? After experiencing it, the former incarnation couldn't help but shudder. He had long known that Luo Fan had some kind of terrifying enemy. Previously, he even took the initiative to ask Luo Fan about it, but he just didn't get an answer. Under such circumstances, it was naturally easy for him to figure out the source of the change that was obviously disadvantageous to Luo Fan at this moment. As for shuddering, it was needless to say. His own self and his own mind could be distorted at will, and he couldn't even find the source of the distortion. How could an ordinary existence do such a thing? In front of him, he was probably not much stronger than an ant. Facing such a situation, how could he not shudder? He wanted to twist this distortion back so that he could revert to that feeling of respect for Luo Fan. However, in the end, he sighed and gave up on that idea. Although he had discovered this distortion, since it had already been created, his mentality had naturally changed. It was already impossible to twist it back. Just like when he gave birth to his true self, he clearly knew that the birth of his self was the result of being assimilated by Luo Fan's worldview of laws. But so what? Since his self had already been born, could it be that he could give up his own self and turn himself into an incarnation without an independent self just because the method of birth wasn't what he wanted? It was the same now. The distortion had already been created, so the self after the distortion was already his new self. Even though he knew that the birth of this self was a distortion of unknown origin, it was no longer possible for him to truly change back to his original self. After all, changing back to his original self was equivalent to completely giving up on his current self. Looks like this abnormal dispute isn't something I can participate in at all. The former incarnation smiled bitterly, turned around, and left. His goal wasn't the perfect world of laws below, but the vast world outside the world of laws, or rather, the vast world outside this island. If it were any other existence, they definitely wouldn't be able to leave this island at this time. After all, this island had already been completely suppressed by the suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. Although it didn't seem much different from an ordinary world, and the operation of the laws seemed to be extremely normal, the living beings and whatnot were also similar to when they weren't suppressed. However, this was just another manifestation of the suppressive effect. It didn't mean that the suppressive effect didn't exist. Since the suppressive effect existed, if he wanted to leave this island or this world, he would obviously have to break through the suppressive effect first. If he couldn't break through the suppressive effect, any existence could only stay here obediently. However, it was obvious that the former incarnation was ultimately different from other existences. No matter what, he was still an existence that had obtained a portion of the authority of this world of laws. Using the power of this world of laws had almost become his instinct. Under such circumstances, he had more opportunities to break through the suppressive force that he originally didn't have compared to other living beings and world creators. After all, the suppressive force was triggered by Luo Fan, and this world of laws was created by Luo Fan. In this way, the power of this world naturally had a certain effect on the suppressive force. perhaps it wouldn't be very strong. At the very least, it seemed impossible to completely eliminate the suppressive force. However, it wasn't impossible to send an individual out, as long as that individual was willing to pay a sufficient price. At this time, the former incarnation began to stimulate his authority over the world of laws and began to mobilize the power of the world of laws, slowly linking him up. During this process, his body gradually rose and gradually broke through the suppressive force above him. He was one step closer to the outside of the suppressive force. During this process, his body, mind, power, and everything else were constantly being melted away. They were melting into the power of the world of laws and the suppressive force. His actions were naturally seen by Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan only glanced at his actions. Although he had given this former incarnation a certain amount of authority, it didn't mean that he valued him much. In fact, the reason why he had given him the authority over the world of laws was because he didn't care about the world of laws previously. Now that this former incarnation was willing to abandon everything he had obtained from the world of laws, including the world of laws, he was naturally happy to see it happen. At this time, the former incarnation's figure continued to rise and gradually approached the edge of the suppressive force. It was also the edge of the boundless sea formed by the power of the tribulations outside. At this point, his entire body had completely melted away, leaving behind only a subtle sense of self that remained within the power and might of the heaven and earth, slowly moving upwards amidst the suppressive force. Apart from this illusory self, everything else had completely melted away and returned to the world of laws, completely devoured by the suppressive force. At this moment, the waves that towered between heaven and earth suddenly rolled up slightly, and a subtle whirlpool suddenly appeared out of thin air, seemingly welcoming the former incarnation's self into it. Immediately afterward, the remaining self of the former incarnation trembled slightly and pounced forward, directly penetrating the obstruction of the suppressive force and rushing into the whirlpool. "You actually didn't stop me." At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the whirlpool. This voice was illusory, somewhat similar to the voice he couldn't determine if he was hallucinating before, but it was more substantial. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was completely certain of the authenticity of this voice. At this moment, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face as he said, "As expected, you've become the world will of this world. You let him out just to make sure of that? Are you sure that I'll definitely appear at this time?" the voice asked. At this moment, the whirlpool distorted slightly and turned into the shape of a huge eye. In essence, it was still a whirlpool, but it looked like a huge eye. "Of course I can't be sure, but I just want to know why you want him to leave, and what benefits will his departure bring to you," Luo Fan said indifferently. At this moment, his expression was incomparably calm, and no one could tell that he was carefully studying the hidden dangers in his world that he couldn't control. Hearing this, the whirlpool seemed to laugh and said, "Maybe there will be benefits, maybe there won't be any benefits. Who knows?" As they spoke, the whirlpool began to gradually dissipate, and the voice also disappeared completely as if it had never appeared before. Seeing the whirlpool disappear and the voice fade, Luo Fan's expression became slightly solemn. "It seems that it's quite difficult to deal with him. After a long time," he sighed slightly. Chapter 2885. Although he had regained his composure, it didn't mean that Luo Fan knew how to deal with the incarnation of the will of this world. Instead, it was because he knew that only by regaining his composure could he find a way to deal with it. Therefore, he regained his composure. The departure of his former incarnation wasn't much of a loss to him. After all, his former incarnation was an outsider to the world of laws. Even if he obtained the authority of the world of laws bestowed by Luo Fan and became the second person with the authority of the world of laws, it was something that Luo Fan could take back with a single thought. Under such circumstances, the departure of his former incarnation was no different from an outsider leaving his world of laws. How could it be considered a loss? As for the authority of the world of laws that the previous incarnation possessed, it had already been sacrificed in the process of drawing upon the might and power of the world of laws. It had been completely stripped away by the suppressive force. Naturally, it wasn't swept away in the slightest. In this case, what did the departure of his former incarnation matter to Luo Fan? However, this didn't mean that it was meaningless for the incarnation of the will to obtain his former incarnation. After all, no matter what, his former incarnation had stayed in his world of laws and had once grasped the authority of the world of laws. This also meant that there were many things about him that could be used. At the very least, there were many things that could be used compared to the incarnation of the will. As for what it could be used for, how it could be used against his world of laws, and how it could be used against him, it would depend on how the incarnation of the will would consider and deal with it. From a certain point of view, sending it away could be said to be sending a convenient passage that could be used against him to the hands of his opponent. If this was considered a loss, then letting his former incarnation leave would actually be a considerable loss for Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan didn't feel that it was a great loss. After all, for the incarnation of the will, he didn't dare to say that he was full of flaws and weaknesses, but he could still easily find some points to target. Under such circumstances, the passageway that the former incarnation represented wasn't that precious. Even if there weren't any, the will incarnation could easily find a lot of them. If Lin Yun thought about it from this aspect, he could send his former incarnation out and let it deal with him according to the path that the former incarnation had pointed out. This would allow him to have a rough idea of the direction that the incarnation would target and save him a lot of energy to be on guard. Of course, even if he could save some energy to defend himself, it would still be limited. At this moment, it was not worth it for Luo Fan and the will incarnation to take him seriously. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly trembled slightly. He suddenly sensed that there seemed to be some subtle changes occurring in the vast world outside this island. This sort of subtle change covered the entire heavens and the earth, and its tentacles had even penetrated deep into the core of this world. It was even to the extent that it affected the grand Tao of this world. Is it going to devour all of the heavens and earth? At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression became increasingly solemn. This kind of change that covered the entire world was fundamentally making this world richer and fuller, making the indescribable mysteries that existed in it more and more numerous. How similar was all of this to the changes that occurred on this island previously? How did the changes on this island come about? At this moment, it was very likely that the changes on this side of the world were due to the same reason. In other words, the essence and power of countless worlds were also integrated into this world. Moreover, judging from the changes that occurred in his world of laws before, in order to trigger such a great change, the amount of essence and power that had been integrated into this world would definitely be countless times more than the amount of worlds that had been integrated into his world of laws before. The amount of essence and power that had been integrated into his world of laws before was already in the hundreds of millions. Right now, the amount of power and essence of the world that had fused with this great world was countless times more than this. As such, it was easy to imagine how many worlds had fused with this world. It could be said that this was definitely a scale that could expand his perspective from a single layer of chaos to the entire simulated state of chaos. It was precisely because of this that he made such a judgment at this moment. At this moment, the only existence that Luo Fan had left in the simulated state of chaos that was related to him was the broken transportation network layer. As the transportation network layer passed the tribulation and became broken, his control over the transportation network layer had unknowingly weakened to a certain limit. Under that limit, He could no longer use the transportation network layer to sense the various things in the simulated state of chaos. Therefore, at this moment, he had completely lost the ability to sense the current situation in the simulated state of chaos from the transportation network layer. In other words, at this time, if he wanted to know the situation in the simulated state of chaos, he could only rely on his own memory and the situation of this world. Therefore, although he had such a guess at this time, he still wasn't completely sure what was going on. Whether it was really as he thought, that most of the worlds in the simulated state of chaos had been devoured and brought into this world. It seems that he was experimenting on me before. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had an inexplicable realization. Previously, the incarnation of the will had created various situations to allow his world of laws to fuse with the essence and power of the many worlds in the transportation network layer. However, one of the purposes of using this place as an experiment was to see what would happen after fusing with the essence and power of those worlds before fusing with the many worlds in the state of chaos. This was obviously one of the purposes. In fact, this might even be the main purpose. As for the others, such as causing impurities to form in Luo Fan's suppression power and causing some existences that he couldn't control to appear in his world of laws, these were obviously just secondary purposes. An inexplicable displeasure instantly surged in his heart. However, this inexplicable displeasure soon disappeared without a trace, and it turned into a subtle joy. However, this kind of situation was also a breakthrough for him. A breakthrough to discover what the things in this world that were not under his control were, and the source of the impurities that caused his suppression power to produce. This seemed unbelievable, but in fact the emergence of such a breakthrough was almost inevitable. After all, if the incarnation of the will really used Luo Fan's island or this perfect world of laws as a test subject and tried to see what would happen after integrating the essence and power of the external world, then the situation that was happening in this great world of laws could also be regarded as a reflection of the changes that happened in the world of laws before. In other words, if one were to look at it from another perspective, everything that was happening in this great world could also be seen as the results of the experiments that had taken place in the past. After all, if it was really as Luo Fan thought, then what had happened in the past and what was happening in this world now were the same kind of change. In this case, they could naturally reflect each other and act as a mirror. Everything that happened in the world of laws was the experimental process of the great world. However, on the other hand, if time was ignored, then what was happening in this great world could also be regarded as the experimental process of the changes that had happened in the world of laws. It was just that from the latter perspective, the experiment happened later, and the changes of the main body appeared first, which seemed more unreasonable. However, no matter how unreasonable it was just unreasonable, and the essence wouldn't change much. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan felt such joy at this time. It was more difficult to know oneself than to see through others. It was the same here. If one wanted to completely understand one's own world and grasp all the details and changes in one's own world, it was obviously more difficult than understanding all the details and changes in other worlds. Therefore, even if the world that was reflected outside was only a world on the same scale as the world of laws, with its reflection, it was enough for Luo Fan to study the changes that might occur in his own world of laws that were beyond his understanding and control. Not to mention, at this moment, the world that was undergoing the same changes as the world of laws was billions of times greater and more vast than the world of laws. Under such circumstances, what might have been an extremely insignificant change to the world of laws would become extremely obvious to this world. At the very least, it would become extremely obvious to him. Under such circumstances, for Luo Fan, who wanted to understand the details contained in the changes, it was self-evident how great the benefits of having this world as a reflection were. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart shook slightly, and the world of laws surged slightly. A subtle impact rushed towards the power related to the true sage in the depths of the world of laws. Boom, boom, boom. For a time, the entire world of laws began to shake wildly, as if some incredible power was shaking the entire world, causing the foundation of the entire world to be shaken. In the blink of an eye, more than half of this world had been completely destroyed. From its original normal appearance, it had turned into a dusky, almost primal state. This was because the impact produced by the vibration had completely destroyed that part of the world, causing more than half of the world to completely collapse. The source of all this was obviously the result of the shock wave caused by the collision between the infinite power of the world of laws and the power related to the true sage that Luo Fan had triggered just now. Compared to the power related to the true sage, the shock wave was relatively insignificant. However, it was such a small shock wave that caused more than half of the world of laws to be destroyed when it acted on the world of laws. It went without saying how incredible the power related to the true sage was. However, such an impact was not without result. At this moment, as more than half of the entire world was destroyed and turned into a chaotic state of chaos, wisps of power that were related to the true sage also surged out. These strands of power looked extremely mysterious and boundless. There was even the charm of a true sage within them, making it impossible for anyone to comprehend it. Just these traces of power were enough to make all cultivators who were not true sages feel despair. In the end, it's still better to extract it directly. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed in his heart. These traces of power seemed to be the same as the power related to the true sage, but in fact, it was not the power related to the true sage. Compared to the trace of power that he had separated from the power that he had obtained by integrating his own perception into it, the power that was now the carrier of his incarnation was fundamentally different. The power that was now being used as the carrier of his incarnation was fundamentally the same as the power related to the true sage that his original body had entrusted to it. Although there was a difference of billions of times in terms of size, now, the traces of power that were produced because of the surging impact were completely different. Although at first glance it seemed to be the same as the power related to the true sage, in essence, it was just because of the endless power that surged with the power related to the true sage. In the end, it was assimilated by the power and its essence was enhanced. It was just like the previous incarnation of the creator of the perfect world that was born after being distorted by the world of laws. Although this power possessed the mysteries of the power related to the true sage, it was fundamentally incomparable to the power related to the true sage. Chapter 2886. After the strands of power took shape, Luo Fan locked onto them immediately. His powerful mind gushed into the strands of power crazily as he tried his best to imprint his own mark on the power. This process was rather bumpy. Compared to the real power related to a true divine, the level of the power was naturally much lower. It was not to the extent that it was impossible for those below the true divine level to truly understand it. However, its level was far beyond the understanding of ordinary cultivators below the true divine level. Under such circumstances, the level of the power was obviously much higher than the current Luo Fan. In this case, what Luo Fan was doing was obviously equivalent to an ant imprinting his own mark on a planet. In the eyes of everyone, even the planet itself, this planet would belong to this ant. It went without saying how difficult it would be. It could be said that if it wasn't for Luo Fan's mental fortitude that had reached an unimaginable height, and that this power wasn't really related to a true divine, this matter wouldn't have been as simple as it seemed. It would have been absolutely impossible. At this moment, Luo Fan's mind continued to pour into the power, trying his best to assimilate the power so that a mark that belonged to him would appear in the power. However, almost all of his mind-will's efforts were in vain. He did not even have the ability to really come into contact with the power, let alone leave a mark that belonged to him in it. Only a very small number of mind-wills, either because of the timing or because the power happened to be in a special transformation stage, could enter the power and really come into contact with it. Although he could only come into contact with it and was still far from leaving his own mark in it, he could still come into contact with it. However, he could still come into contact with it, and it was considered a good start. Such mind wills occupied a relatively small proportion of the total mind will that Luo Fan intended to pour into the power. Could be said that there were only 1 or 2 mind wills in a million mind wills. However, this was enough for Luo Fan. After all, to him, as long as he could continue, the final outcome was almost certain. The only difference was the level of efficiency. There were only 1 or 2 mind wills in a million mind wills that could come into contact with that power. In that case, he would use billions of trillions of mind wills to try. In this way, even if there were only 1 or 2 mind wills in a million mind wills, he would still be able to achieve his goal in the end. Luo Fan's efficiency was self-evident. The injection of mind wills almost completely ignored the changes in time. Unknowingly, the amount of Luo Fan's spirit will in that power had already reached a level where it was enough to leave a mark that belonged to him in that power. This situation was like an ant wanting to terraform a planet and leave a mark that belonged to it. Anyone who saw the planet would know that it was modified by it and that it belonged to it. This was obviously an almost impossible task. However, if the number of ants increased to billions of trillions, trillions of trillions, then it was only natural that traces of ants would be left on this planet. Even if an ant wanted to leave a mark, it would be impossible. This was the situation at this time. Luo Fan's mind wills were equivalent to an ant. At this time, the countless mind wills that were piled up in it were equivalent to an infinite number of ants. It was naturally an almost impossible task for an ant to change that power and create a mark that belonged to him in that power. When the number of ants increased to a certain extent, it would be impossible for him not to leave a mark even if he wanted to. In the end, under the impact of the endless mind wills, that power gradually distorted and gradually transformed into a humanoid form. A figure that looked almost identical to Luo Fan. "I've finally succeeded." At this moment, the figure revealed a relaxed expression and let out a sigh. This voice was exactly the same as Luo Fan's voice. Obviously, this power had been completely refined by Luo Fan and became the basis of his incarnation. It was just like the wisp of power related to true divine previously. Such an incarnation was much worse than the incarnation formed by the power related to true divine. If Luo Fan himself did not have the authority to control the power related to true divine, he would not be able to separate a trace of power to act as his own incarnation. Even if it was just a tiny trace, he would naturally want to use the real power related to true divine to act as his own incarnation. However, even if it was not comparable to the power related to true divine, the essence of this power was much stronger than that of ordinary existences below true divine. In this way, the power of the incarnation that was born was not something that ordinary existences could resist. At the very least, it was enough for Luo Fan to form this incarnation. At this moment, the incarnation swept across the world of laws that had been mostly destroyed. With a slight thought, an inexplicable wave was released from his body and covered the entire world of laws in the blink of an eye. As the wave spread, the entire world of laws began to distort indescribably. Time seemed to flow backwards in an instant, and all the damage caused by the impact began to recover rapidly. In a blink of an eye, most of the broken world had already become as good as new. It was as if the destruction from before had never appeared. Even the living beings that had been destroyed had been completely resurrected, and were still living in the world of laws like before. It was the same for the world founders. That's right, the creators of the world weren't completely unaffected by the destruction of most of the half-world. Although not all the world founders were destroyed, the number of world founders that were destroyed was still in the hundreds of millions. Now that the world had completely recovered under the will of Luo Fan's avatar, the creators of the world had also completely recovered at the same time. Moreover, not a single one of them knew that they had died just now. What this situation represented couldn't be any more obvious. This meant that the creators of the world had truly integrated into the world of laws. Now, rather than saying that they were world founders, it would be more accurate to say that they were world founders within the world of laws. Complete integration. Luo Fan looked at this scene with all sorts of inexplicable guesses in his heart. In his heart, he didn't want these world founders to completely integrate into his world of laws. After all, each of these world founders had their own unique worldview, and each of them had unique characteristics that were different from the world of laws. Integrating them into the world of laws didn't bring many benefits to the world of laws. Instead, it would cause the world of laws to be out of his control, or in other words, existences that conflicted with his worldview. Such a situation was obviously not what he wanted to see. However, it was a pity that the process of these world founders integrating into the world of laws wasn't under his control. Even if he wanted to stop it, he couldn't think of a way to stop it. By the time he came back to his senses, the numerous world founders had already completely integrated into the world of laws. Even if he wanted to abandon and expel them, he was no longer confident that he could truly achieve his goal perfectly. Not to mention anything else, at this time, the existence of the world founders that had integrated into the world of laws, causing the suppression force to produce impurities, was clearly not under his control. In fact, he couldn't even find it. Under such circumstances, how could he possibly expel it? If he completely ignored the impurities that he couldn't control, then what was the point of expelling the world founders? The hidden dangers left behind by the world founders still remained in the world of laws. On the contrary, the benefits that the world founders could bring to him had been expelled. Such an approach was obviously meaningless. Although he didn't care about the benefits brought to him by the integration of these world founders, he wasn't so unreasonable that he would rather expel these benefits for the sake of mental cleanliness. With such thoughts flashing through his mind, he shifted his attention away from the world founders. He turned his head and looked at the force that was related to the true sage behind him. That force didn't seem to be any different from before, and it seemed as if nothing had changed. The entire force was so calm that it made people wonder if it could continue to be calm until the end of time. Looking at the calm appearance of this force, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. The shock wave that was produced before was enough to completely destroy most of the world of laws. To this force, perhaps it was just like the fur on a living creature that was slightly shaken. Sighing to himself, he turned around and left. In the blink of an eye, his figure had already crashed into the suppression force and arrived at the edge of the suppression force. This suppression force was absolute to other existences, and even the sight of it would affect them. However, for Luo Fan, who was the one who cast this suppression force, it was just a force that he could control at will. In this way, he could naturally move about freely within this suppressive force, and he could even reach any location within this suppressive force at will. After arriving here, the new incarnation didn't stop at all. He directly stepped out of the suppression force and stepped into the boundless world outside. Boom, 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 boom. For a time, the world was stirred and the waves were rolling. Towering waves were produced continuously, pressing towards him. He had only appeared outside the suppressive power, but he had already triggered an intense reaction from the boundless world outside. In the face of this monstrous wave, Luo Fan just smiled faintly. With a wave of his hand, a suppressive force instantly pressed down on the wave, causing the monstrous wave to completely lose its momentum and directly stagnate in the void. It looked like a lifelike sculpture. Around the wave, the seawater tumbled, and a terrifying force was constantly generated. It rushed towards this area, trying to push the stagnant monstrous wave forward. However, the moment the waves entered a certain range, they instantly froze and turned into the same statues. This situation caused layers of patterns to appear on the back of the wave. It seemed more and more chaotic, and also more and more dangerous. The terrifying commotion continued to spread outwards, constantly expanding towards the already turbulent seawater in the surroundings. It was as if there was an unimaginable existence behind the endless seawater, using all kinds of unimaginable methods to push the seawater. The range of the wave continued to expand, and the height of the wave behind the monstrous wave continued to rise. Although it was still inferior to the monstrous wave, its main goal was still to push the monstrous wave to crush Luofan. However, this was only temporary. The wave was obstructed in this area, and its power continued to accumulate. The wave behind it was bound to get taller and taller. When the height of the wave surpassed the monstrous wave in front of him that had already been frozen, the wave would turn the tables and completely overwhelm the monstrous wave in front of it, crushing Luofan and the monstrous wave together. In the face of such a situation, the wisest thing for Luofan to do was to leave quickly and keep changing his position. He wouldn't stay in any position on the sea for too long. However, this wasn't what he was doing at this moment. He just stood there quietly, waiting for the monstrous wave in front of him to continue to evolve. "Let me see how far you can go," he thought to himself as he carefully observed the various changes inside and outside the monstrous wave. Moving around in this world at all times was clearly not something he was willing to do. It wasn't that he couldn't do it, but rather that he wanted to do it and being forced to do it were two completely different concepts. If he wanted to do it, it was his interest, but if he was forced to do it, it was his incompetence. Chapter 2887. Therefore, what Luofan needed to do now was to find a way to gain a foothold in this world. It wasn't too difficult for him to move around in this world and not stay in the same place for too long. However, he needed another choice. He needed to have the ability to gain a foothold in this world. This was a matter of choice, and also a matter of ability. At this moment, an even larger and more terrifying wave, which was enough to completely crush the sea wave and the place where Luofan was located, came crashing down towards Luofan like the sky had collapsed. Ga. After the wave approached Luofan for a certain distance, it suddenly froze. It was also suppressed by the suppressive force. The suppressive effect was so strong that even though there was still an endless amount of seawater behind him, the endless impact was constantly pushing towards the center. It wanted to push the huge wave forward and let it release a more terrifying destructive power. It wanted to completely destroy Luofan's incarnation in the center. It couldn't let the suppressed wave shake even a little. It was as if this sort of suppression and stagnation had already become the fundamental laws of this world, and it was something that no power or method could resist. Faced with this situation, a faint smile appeared on Luofan's face. This situation obviously meant that even if he didn't move in this world, the wave wouldn't be able to break through the obstruction of the suppressive force and wouldn't really affect him. At this moment, the waves behind him were still constantly pushing towards the center. The seawater was endless. If the front was blocked, the seawater behind would push further, brewing an even bigger wave towards the center. In this way, no matter how high the wave in front was, the wave that appeared behind him would be even higher than the original wave that came towards Luofan. In the end, after a while, an even more terrifying wave came crashing over. This time, the wave had exceeded the height of the suppressive force. It directly crushed down from the sky like the Milky Way was shattering. This terrifying scene made people feel as if the entire sky was collapsing. But even so, the wave was instantly suppressed when it reached a certain height. It was completely stagnant in the void, and it looked just like any other wave. After this happened a few times, the place where Luofan was looked like a huge sphere from the outside. The sphere was a hollow sphere of seawater. It looked perfectly round from the outside, but one could see the shape of the front end inside. Endless waves constantly rushed towards this sphere, but the final result was like seawater crashing against a diamond. They just kept passing by the sphere, but in the end they didn't leave any trace on the sphere. This process lasted for several days. In these days, the sea waves were monstrous. The endless waves turned into waves from all directions and constantly rushed towards the place where Luo Fan was located. They smashed fiercely on the surface and quickly slid away. Then, another wave rushed over and slid away again, and so on and so forth, the cycle repeated without end. Until today, after several days of impact, the sphere didn't shake at all and didn't have the slightest change in shape. It looked the same as it did at the beginning, as if time hadn't passed at all. Perhaps it already knew that this method could no longer have any effect on the suppressive force, so the existence that controlled the waves, which was also the incarnation of the will, finally couldn't be bothered to continue. The waves no longer increased in size. Instead, they were like an ordinary island. Although there were waves constantly crashing towards it, the intensity had become ordinary. Evidently, at this time, the waves had already regarded Luo Fan's incarnation as an existence similar to the island beside it. Sensing that the waves outside had calmed down, Luo Fan revealed a faint smile. "It seems that I've succeeded." With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. With the suppressive force that he had drawn from the other incarnation, he left the sphere of waves and appeared on a relatively calm sea in the distance. As he left, the sphere suddenly trembled and an endless impact crushed towards the center. In the end, it let out an earth-shattering roar. Amidst the roar, all the waves were completely shattered and turned into endless seawater that poured towards the center, setting off a huge commotion. At this moment, the waves surged again where Luo Fan was and began to rush towards him again. However, compared to before, the waves didn't seem to be as active as before. It felt more like they were just doing it for show. It was easily suppressed by Luo Fan, who had completely suppressed it. Moreover, compared to before, the suppression this time was not the kind that froze the waves in the void. Instead, it was the kind that directly suppressed the waves. In other words, after the suppressive force passed, the waves were completely flattened, and the surroundings of this area had completely turned into a calm sea. If it was before, the surrounding seawater would definitely be turbulent again, and endless waves would continuously surge from all directions in an attempt to annihilate Luo Fan's incarnation. But this time, after the confrontation that lasted for a few days, the will incarnation had clearly given up on the idea of using waves to deal with Lin Yun's incarnation. As a result, after being suppressed, the waves directly gave up on continuing. They only surged slightly outside, directly causing the surface of the sea within a radius of several 100,000 feet to become as smooth as a mirror, directly reflecting the clouds in the sky. After looking around, Luo Fan chose a target for himself. The target was none other than the one that was closest to him. It was a certain underwater palace that was formed when the will incarnation absorbed the many worlds that simulated the state of chaos. The will incarnation absorbed the essence and power of the world that simulated the state of chaos, and in the end, it took on all sorts of strange forms in this world. Some looked like islands, some looked like heavenly palaces above the clouds, some looked like underwater palaces, and some looked like some kind of airflow underground, some kind of oars, and even some kind of changing patterns. It could be said that if Luo Fan couldn't think of it, there was nothing that didn't exist. If this world was said to be a little monotonous before, as if there was only a huge ocean and there was nothing to write home about in many other aspects, then this world had now become many times more plentiful. It could be said that there were simply too many things that could be discussed in this world. In fact, any location and any phenomenon could be found, and any aspect that could be discussed could be found. At this moment, the underwater palace that Luo Fan wanted to explore was one of these changes. It was also one of the changes that occurred after the essence and power of a certain world was absorbed. The seawater below was extremely repulsive to him. If he came into direct contact with the seawater, the seawater would not be stingy in pouring its endless power on him. However, this obviously could not stop Luo Fan's action. As a cultivator, why would he need to swim and dive in the sea with difficulty like mortals? With a spell, he would naturally be able to avoid the water completely. This was only for ordinary cultivators. For Luo Fan, this method was even more mysterious. At this time, he only needed to slightly guide the suppression power from the other incarnation to create a space for himself that was completely isolated from the seawater. This allowed him to dive to any depth in the seawater at will, and he could also go to any position he wanted through the bottom of the sea. At this moment, his body did not come into contact with any seawater at all, and he directly arrived outside the underwater palace in the depths of the sea. Although this underwater palace was called a palace, it was actually a huge city. A city that normally wouldn't appear in any world, a city that was like a world. The entire city was so vast that one would need to calculate its length and width in light years. However, the city was not as lifeless as the outside world. In other words, it was not as lifeless as the outside world. It was like a normal world in which there were countless living beings. There were even various cultivators living, cultivating, and growing in it. For these living beings, they did not know that they were at the bottom of the sea, nor did they know that they were just in a city. In their senses, they were in a world, a vast and boundless world. The walls of this city were extremely tall. Behind the walls was an almost boundless wasteland. Or rather, an empty space. After a long enough distance from the wasteland, it was the place where intelligent living beings lived. All sorts of buildings began to gradually appear, and all sorts of living beings began to appear. Perhaps the living beings in the city did not find it strange, but Luo Fan only needed to take a look to know that this city was different from other worlds. There were all sorts of living beings born in this city, and there was no humanoid living being among them. This was needless to say. After all, this city was originally a world that was completely different from the laws of the world, so the beings with born Taoism aptitude naturally could not look like humans. However, what was really strange was the various natural landscapes that were derived from it, such as mountains, lakes, forests, grasslands, swamps, and all sorts of vegetation. Everything had traces of being specially designed. For example, there were naturally many buildings on the mountains that were suitable for intelligent living beings to live in. There would also naturally be some buildings like tree houses in the forests, and there would naturally be corresponding buildings in the grasslands, swamps, and vegetation. It did not look like a naturally formed world at all. At this moment, Luo Fan directly stepped into the city, and with a glance, he already understood everything about the city. This city was originally a world of its own. The creator of this world had also been pulled over by this world, and he was now also in this city. However, the situation of his existence was not in the form of a cultivator like before. Instead, he had turned into some sort of law of this city, and was implemented in all aspects of this city. He had completely integrated with this city. At this moment, no matter how hard Luo Fan tried to sense, he could not feel the mental fluctuations that belonged to the creator of this world. Obviously, the original creator of this world had already lost his consciousness. This city had completely integrated with this world, and it had an extremely close connection with all the laws of this world, and even the great Tao within it. Although it had only appeared in this world not long ago, and the entire process was witnessed by Luo Fan, it naturally gave off a feeling that it was inseparable from this world. However, it naturally gave off a feeling that it was inseparable from this world. It was as if it had existed since the birth of this world, and would continue to exist in the endless distant future. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan frowned slightly. This situation was a little difficult for him to understand. Why did the incarnation of the will deliberately create this situation? Could it be to make up for the lack of this world, or could it greatly strengthen its power? All sorts of inexplicable thoughts flashed through his mind, and in the end, he shook his head and thought to himself, "Then let's see what will happen if I destroy it." When he said to destroy it, he naturally didn't mean completely destroying the city. Instead, he wanted to destroy the plan of the incarnation of the will, and completely change the situation that the incarnation of the will had deliberately created. Among them, the most effective target was obviously already in front of him. It was none other than the creator of the world, of the original world of the city, who had now turned into a certain vital rule of this city. Chapter 2888. With a slight thought, Luo Fan had already arrived at the top of a certain mountain in this underwater city. Like the other mountains in this city, this mountain peak had many man-made buildings that were obviously traces of civilization. At the peak of this mountain peak, there was a gazebo. The size of this gazebo was just right for Luo Fan's body size, making Luo Fan look rather harmonious in it. This was also the result of his special choice. There were actually quite a lot of mountains with gazebos on them. However, not all of them were suitable for living beings that were the size of Luo Fan. Some gazebos were suitable for living beings that were smaller than Luo Fan or even the size of an ant. Some were suitable for living beings that were hundreds of meters or even thousands of meters tall. Evidently, Luo Fan was not interested in staying in a gazebo that was not suitable for his body size. Therefore, he chose this gazebo to stay on a mountain peak that happened to be his size. Standing in the pavilion, Luo Fan could not help but sigh in his heart at the wonder of this city as he sensed the pavilion that was formed naturally. After randomly choosing a seat in this gazebo and sitting down, he closed his eyes and carefully sensed the law that was clearly formed by the creator of this world. That law was constantly circulating in the city, and it was closely related to everything in the city. It seemed to decide and control everything behind the scenes, but it did not have any consciousness and did not show any signs of intelligence. At this moment, the moment Luo Fan's senses came into contact with this law, he felt an indescribable emptiness in his heart. This emptiness was clearly the feeling that the law gave him on the spiritual level. This kind of emptiness meant that what he had sensed earlier was completely correct. The laws indeed didn't have any sentience. As an existence transformed by the creator of this world, it actually became ignorant and had no intelligence, and could only operate according to a fixed and mechanical program. This was clearly an extremely sad thing. That was because Luo Fan had no friendship with the creator of this world. At this moment, he could not help but sigh. There must be a remnant. Let me see where your core remnant is. With a thought, Luo Fan sorted out his emotions and thought to himself. With that thought in mind, his consciousness surged, and he no longer had any scruples as he surged toward that wave of rules. In an instant, the entire city trembled slightly. All the living beings in the city sensed some sort of subtle change in their surroundings, as if an unbelievable existence had suddenly descended upon the city. This city was at the bottom of the sea. Endless seawater filled every part of this city, making it look like a crystal palace at the bottom of the sea. At this moment, as the city shook, the endless seawater that filled the city also began to shake violently. The shaking of the seawater was completely different from the shaking of the city from before. This kind of tremor was 10 times stronger than the tremor of the city. 10 times more obvious. In fact, the destruction it caused was more than 10 times stronger. In just an instant, countless things in the city were instantly crushed by the impact of the seawater, and many fragments flew in all directions. This kind of change should have caused the deaths of many living beings. However, at this moment, the law that was formed by the creator of this world moved. All sorts of subtle changes appeared in the law, and an indescribable and strange power was instantly produced. It acted on the many living beings in various ways, such as guiding, redirecting, or resisting. In the end, even many of the buildings in the city were destroyed, but in the end, not a single living being died. This was simply a miracle. At this moment, Luo Fan felt a strange repulsive force acting on his body. This was the rejection of this city towards him. Or, to be more specific, it was the rejection of him by the creator of the world, who had already turned into the unconscious rules of the world. Evidently, his actions of not caring about the lives of the living beings in this city had touched the bottom line of the law. At the same time, as the seawater surged in the sky above Luo Fan's head, a pitch-black liquid vaguely appeared. It was just like the tribulation clouds that appeared in the sky of a normal world. Faintly, there was a faint electric light flickering within the pitch-black liquid. At this moment, Luo Fan's consciousness sensed an indescribable fury from the law, a fury that was completely targeted at him. Sensing these changes, Luo Fan was not alarmed. Instead, he was overjoyed. Although this situation was targeted at him, it also broke the silence of the law. Although this was not as good as directly activating the remnant will of the creator of this world in the law, it was already a step closer than before. At this moment, he did not care about the rejection of this city, nor did he care about the pitch-black liquid that was brewing an attack. He only focused on injecting more spirit will into the law, stirring it according to the law, and making contact with the fury that surged from the depths of the law. This emotion was not the true will of the creator of this world, but it originated from that will. Even if it was just a remnant of the will, under such circumstances, this fury was clearly the best breakthrough point to make contact with the will of the creator of this world. At this moment, the fury became even more intense. When his spirit will was infused, the tremors in the city and the waves in the sea became more and more intense. The pitch-black liquid that had just appeared in the sky finally brewed some power to a certain limit. In an instant, endless lightning bolts rushed out of the pitch-black liquid and crushed towards Luo Fan in an overwhelming manner. The lightning net was extremely dazzling, and each bolt of lightning was the size of a pillar. They were as bright and dazzling as the sun and moon. When they appeared here, they directly illuminated the originally dark bottom of the sea. This lightning was clearly not ordinary. If ordinary lightning came into contact with the seawater, it would definitely spread endlessly and eventually disappear. However, this lightning bolt showed no signs of dissipating. As it pressed down, the lightning became unimaginably condensed. Although the surrounding seawater was constantly surging, it could not stir up the lightning at all, nor could it draw out the slightest bit of it. The lightning was even more concentrated here than it was in the air. It was exactly the same as it was when it left the black liquid and finally pressed down on Luo Fan's head. Crack, crack, boom. Under the cover of the lightning net, countless cracks instantly appeared on the mountain peak. The entire mountain peak seemed to have instantly turned from a complete and flawless appearance into the appearance of countless small stones piled together. Although it hadn't collapsed yet, it was clear that there was some kind of external force suppressing these rocks. Obviously, the external force that was suppressing these stones and preventing them from collapsing and shattering was, of course, Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure did not change at all. The lightning seemed to directly cover his entire body, as if endless power was directly released to his entire body. However, in the end, it did not leave a trace on his body at all. It gave people the feeling that these lightning bolts were just illusions, or that his body was just an illusion. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. Looking at him, it was as if nothing had happened before. The pitch-black liquid in the sky obviously did not stop there. More lightning was continuously released from it, covering the sky and covering the earth as it pounced on this mountain peak. Boom, 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 boom. Endless sounds and fluctuations kept erupting from this location. Light constantly shone, making this place seem like a sun in this underwater city. The dazzling light directly illuminated the void within a radius of hundreds of thousands of miles, making this area seem like it was exposed to the scorching sun. As time passed, the number of lightning bolts that were blasted out increased. The momentum seemed to become more and more terrifying, and the movement also became louder. Under the bombardment of the countless lightning bolts, the mountain peak shattered more and more thoroughly. At the beginning, during the first bombardment, the mountain peak could still be seen to be formed by countless stones piled together. However, as time passed, as it suffered more and more bombardment, the mountain peak became more and more finely fragmented. Not long after, the entire mountain peak could no longer be seen by the details piled up together. On the contrary, the mountain peak appeared extremely solid, complete, and sturdy. This naturally wasn't because there were too many bombardments, but because the mountain peak had reformed and became complete again. It was because the mountain peak had been smashed so thoroughly that the fragments that formed the mountain peak were so fine that they were indistinguishable to the naked eye. In the end, after they gathered together, ordinary people could no longer see the existence of the cracks. And since the cracks couldn't be seen, the mountain peak naturally appeared relatively complete, and no cracks could be seen. This was why such a strange phenomenon occurred. If Luo Fan were to leave this place at this time, this mountain would definitely collapse immediately, turning into a vast amount of dust that would scatter in all directions. However, at this moment, with Luo Fan's existence and suppression, even if the mountain peak had been smashed to such a degree, and even if the fragments formed were so fine that they could no longer be seen with the naked eye, the mountain peak still maintained its original form. It was even to the extent that because Luo Fan's suppression was too strong, it even made this mountain seem even more solid than before it was bombarded. This process lasted for 9 days and 9 nights. During these 9 days and 9 nights, Luo Fan's actions didn't change at all. He had been constantly injecting his will into the laws to search for the source of the law's anger, to search for the remnant will of the creator of the world. This action had clearly touched that rule, and it had even touched the city. As a result, the city was constantly trembling, and the seawater that filled the entire city was also trembling endlessly. Under such circumstances, after 9 days and 9 nights, there were very few buildings in the city that were still intact. Other than these extremely rare few buildings that were still in good condition, all the other buildings within the city had already been destroyed by the many intertwining shockwaves. Currently, all that was left were ruins. However, due to the mysterious effects of the laws, not a single living being had died in the city even at this stage. At the very least, not a single person had died because of the tremors. Such a strange change might not have caught the attention of all living beings in the beginning, but it was clear that as time passed, after 9 days and 9 nights, even the most careless of living beings had noticed this anomaly. Could it be that the world is changing itself? At this moment, this was what the living beings in the city guessed about the current situation. After all, no matter how they looked at it, it seemed like the world was changing itself. If it was an external attack, how could they be protected? How was it possible that the entire city, or rather the entire world, was almost completely destroyed, but not a single living being had died? This must be because the world still had a lot of energy left, which was why it could cause such a situation. Evidently, under the attack of external forces, the possibility of this world having excess power was relatively small. After 9 days and 9 nights, the pitch-black liquid floating above Luo Fan's head had already expanded thousands of times. Chapter 2889. This city was completely different from how it had been 9 days and 9 nights ago. It seemed like it was difficult to treat it as the same place as the city that had been like a world 9 days and 9 nights ago. After this period of development, the law formed by the original creator of the world had unknowingly expanded thousands of times. That's right, this law was constantly expanding under Luo Fan's actions. Along with this expansion came the invisible willpower that existed within this law. That will had given birth to the emotion of anger. As Luo Fan continued to pour his spirit will into it and traced it back to its source, it had become more and more intense. It was so much so that it had gone a step deeper into the city, manipulating even more power in the city, causing the destruction of the city to become more and more thorough. Let me see when I can regain my consciousness. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes seemed to penetrate endless barriers and see the true appearance of the depths of the law. The wave of anger continued to expand, and as it did, the pitch-black liquid in the sky also continued to expand. The power and destructive power it released also continued to increase. However, this was nothing to Luo Fan. Not to mention the fact that this incarnation could guide the suppression power from the other incarnation, just by relying on the incarnation's material, it could completely ignore the extremely monotonous attack that was purely manifested in the form of thunder and lightning. Therefore, he allowed this anger to expand, and he was not worried that it would cause any harm to him. On the contrary, he was looking forward to it. He hoped that this swelling anger would eventually trigger some crucial qualitative change. At Luo Fan's level, he naturally knew that emotions could be transformed. In other words, under certain circumstances, the emotion of anger could be transformed into joy, sorrow, pain, bitterness, and many other emotions. In other words, when the conditions were met, even a wave of anger would be enough to transform into a state of mind where all kinds of complicated emotions intertwined like normal living beings. Once this state appeared, the remnant of the willpower hidden in the depths of the law that Luo Fan had yet to find would definitely change. It might even be completely activated in an instant and become even more complete and perfect. All that was needed was for this current wave of anger to expand, strengthen, and transform. Of course, this could be regarded as the second choice. Luo Fan's greatest reliance was, of course, at this moment, he was using his spirit and will to search for the will that existed in the depths of the laws, the will that was left behind by the Creator of the world. If he could find the remnant willpower, there was naturally no need to say anything at all. Just himself would be enough to activate the willpower. Although he might not be able to make the willpower perfect immediately, it would be enough to give the willpower a chance to be complete in the future. As for which method would work, it would depend on whether Luo Fan was faster or the evolution of the anger was faster. Luo Fan continued to search, allowing his spirit and willpower to continuously penetrate the depths of the law. In the end, when the 9 days and 9 nights were about to pass, the anger that existed in the law finally expanded to a certain limit. A subtle cracking sound came from within the laws. At this instant, all the huge movements in the entire city stopped at this moment. It was as if time had completely stopped at this moment. Has it begun? Seeing this scene, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. At this moment, even the pitch-black liquid above his head stopped at the same time. All the power had completely stopped in midair, and was motionless. This situation was clearly caused by a huge change that was closely related to the existence of this city. And at this moment, the only thing that could change was that law. At this moment, the anger that had already swelled to a certain limit started to have countless invisible cracks appearing from within amidst the crackling sounds. As these cracks appeared, other emotions began to emerge from the anger. They began to interweave and mix, gradually turning into a more and more complete emotional system. Unknowingly, a wave of anger seemed to have turned into the heart of a living being, although it didn't have a core or a true main body, only various emotions. Soon after, the law began to tremble violently. A ray of light flashed from the depths of the law and directly penetrated an endless distance. From a place that even Luo Fan couldn't reach after spending 9 days and 9 nights, it directly arrived at the mass of emotions. It directly occupied the core of the mass of emotions and became the main body of the mass of emotions. After arriving here, the mass of emotions began to rapidly condense. A subtle blurry feeling gradually emerged from the amalgamation of emotions. The mass of emotions gradually gave birth to a feeling of a soul. A feeling that was complete, independent, inseparable, undistorted, and unchangeable gradually emerged from it. This was the charm of a powerhouse's soul. It was the charm of a true powerhouse's soul. At this moment, Faced with this change, Luo Fan's smile finally blossomed completely. Although he didn't find the remnant of the will in the end, at least the current changes had told him that his plan had succeeded. He had finally activated the will of the world will. At this moment, the spirit light continued to expand and grow stronger within the body of emotions. At this moment, the law began to shrink continuously. The frequency at which it shrank was no different from the frequency at which the light expanded and strengthened. It was as if the light was constantly absorbing the law in an indescribable way to strengthen itself. This process seemed to be extremely long, but also extremely fast. In this state where even time was stagnant, it was completely impossible to determine how much time had passed. After an unknown period of time, everything calmed down. However, the law had completely disappeared. In its place was the figure of a living being hovering in the void, looking around with an indescribable expression. "I've been resurrected," he murmured, his voice containing an extremely complicated emotion. "Thank you for saving me, fellow cultivator." At this moment, he saw Luo Fan below. His heart skipped a beat, and he already knew why he was able to completely recover from that near-death state. An inexplicable sense of gratitude surged from the bottom of his heart, and he took a step forward, arriving in front of Luo Fan in an instant. His figure was not that of a human, but an extremely strange form of body. It also did not conform to Luo Fan's sense of beauty. However, because he was the creator of a world, he possessed the characteristics of a born Taoism aptitude, which revealed a perfect charm. "We're just helping each other." Luo Fan smiled. At this moment, the sky trembled slightly, or rather, the sea trembled slightly. A huge whirlpool appeared above their heads, and an indescribable suction was produced from the whirlpool, acting directly on the creator in front of Luo Fan. The suction was so powerful that the creator felt his body gradually losing control due to the suction. He began to float uncontrollably, continuously approaching the whirlpool. In that instant, the creator of the world's expression turned extremely ugly. "What the hell is this?" he roared furiously. As the power in his body surged, unimaginable power was released from his body, instantly stirring the endless seawater around him. Or rather, the endless power of the tribulations was under his control at this moment. It began to transform under his will, surging towards the huge whirlpool in the sky, and resolutely collided with it. Boom, 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 the whirlpool shook violently, vaguely showing signs of instability. Luo Fan raised his head and frowned deeply when he saw this. "He's interfering again. It was the same for my previous incarnation, and it's the same for the creator now. Could he be collecting the wills of the world creators that entered the sea?" Such a thought flashed through his mind. The scene in front of him was quite familiar to him. Previously, when the former incarnation abandoned everything and only left his own self to charge out of the suppressive force, the vortex that represented the will of the world appeared in front of him and directly sucked in the remnant self of the former incarnation. During the entire process, the former incarnation did not even have the ability to resist at all. Now, the world creator that had just been revived had only just appeared, and the whirlpool had appeared once again, trying to suck him in once more. This made him suspect that the world's will's goal was to have a sufficiently powerful self-consciousness. However, this kind of words did not make sense either. After all, if that was the goal of the world's creator, then its previous behavior was a little strange. After all, it had used all its means to suppress the self-consciousness of the world creators. Otherwise, Luo Fan wouldn't have spent so much effort to resurrect the creator of this world. At this moment, the whirlpool began to slowly spin. As it spun, the control over the seawater, or rather, the power of the tribulations, that was constantly charging at it and releasing destructive power, seemed to have been seized in an instant. In the blink of an eye, it was completely under the world creator's control and began to gently fill the surroundings of the whirlpool. It even vaguely showed signs of joining the whirlpool, making the whirlpool seem even larger. Although the world creator could slightly control the seawater and a portion of the endless tribulations that existed in this world due to the previous transformation, he could only control an insignificant portion of it. However, he could only control an insignificant portion of it. How was such a level of control enough for the world's will to look at? If the world's will did not mind, he could indeed control some of the tribulations to achieve some of his goals, such as carrying out certain destruction or changes that he needed. However, if the world's will wanted it, even if he expended all his energy and paid all the price that he could, he would not be able to control even the slightest bit of control. Under such circumstances, he would be able to figure out what had just happened. Not only did the world creator want to control the tribulations in front of the world's will, but he also wanted to use the tribulations to attack the whirlpool formed by the world's will. No matter how one looked at it, it was like using the tentacles of an octopus to attack an octopus. How could he succeed? At this moment, the world creator reacted. The power in his body erupted once again, and the endless power instantly gathered into a world around him. Like a fist, it fiercely charged towards the whirlpool that was growing larger and larger. In the end, it smashed into the whirlpool and collided with it. Boom, 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 earth-shattering rumbles erupted from the whirlpool in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the terrifying commotion turned into ripples that spread out in all directions. Along with the ripples were terrifying shock waves that could shatter a part of the world and cut off a thick layer of the seabed. Shock waves. The commotion lasted for a long time before it stopped. When it came to a complete stop, Luo Fan looked over and found that the vortex that was the manifestation of the will of the heavens and earth above his head was completely undamaged. On the other hand, the world formed by the power of the creator of the world had completely disappeared, as if it had never existed. Just by looking at the situation of the whirlpool, one would even suspect that the terrifying commotion from before was just an illusion of the spectators. How could this be? The world creator cried out in horror. Chapter 2891. The heaven and earth creator's expression froze. How could he forget? Although he did not feel anything at that time, he only felt as if he was controlled by some unimaginably terrifying power. Then, his body and his world were thrown into this world. After that, everything became blurry and hazy, and he even forgot about the passage of time. When he came back to his senses, it was time for the anger that Luo Fan had guided to derive into countless emotions, and then reaccommodate that part of his self, allowing that part of his self to be nourished by the many emotions to be restored to its complete state. However, he only needed to think about everything that had happened before, and everything was crystal clear to him. It could even be said to be unforgettable, so how could he forget it? Was it a punishment? Or could it be that everything that happened before was just a preparation to capture me now? Or was it a remedy for me to break free from its plan? The heaven and earth creator murmured. At this moment, when he understood that the world's will had been targeting him from the beginning, he instantly had many guesses. After all, he was a heaven and earth creator. As for heaven and earth creators, their personalities might be different. Some might be relatively timid and cowardly, but there were no fools. Perhaps the heaven and earth creator was not the kind of powerhouse that could derive countless schemes with a single thought. However, when things came to a head, he would definitely be able to make the corresponding deductions and make the corresponding guesses. Perhaps. As for the specifics, you'll have to find out for yourself. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. The heaven and earth creator regained his composure, and an indescribable determination appeared on his face. I must find out the answer. I'm not the kind of person who can be schemed against and not react. Even if the one who schemed against me might be the world's will of this world, I will still do so. Then, he descended and entered the pavilion that Luo Fan was at. He appeared in front of Luo Fan and bowed to Luo Fan. Next, I'll leave my safety to you, fellow Taoist. On the other hand, I won't refuse any of your requests. The creator of this world was rather clear-headed. Previously, he had not been captured by the will of the world and was still able to freely converse with Luo Fan. Clearly, Luo Fan had used some sort of method. In other words, in the following days, he could only stay by Luo Fan's side at all times. At the very least, he had to stay within the range of Luo Fan's power. Only then would he be able to prevent the will of the world from seizing any gaps and taking him away. In this way, a fact was determined. For a very long period of time, he could only rely on Luo Fan. He could only follow Luo Fan wherever he wanted to go, and obviously, Luo Fan had no obligation to protect him all the time. Although Luo Fan did not let up when facing the world will, it did not mean that he would always be like this. If he did not express anything, who knew when Luo Fan would completely ignore him? Therefore, he wisely expressed his loyalty at this moment. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled. Don't worry, fellow Taoist. Didn't I say it before? We are just supporting each other. The creator finally relaxed at this moment and smiled. No matter what, fellow Taoist knows more than I do. Feel free to instruct me. Luo Fan didn't say anything more. He smiled and said, Our strength is still too weak. So, we need to find more companions. The creator came to a realization. He knew that in the following days, they would most likely have to move from one world to another and carry out everything that Luo Fan had done in this city. In this way, their strength seemed to be able to continue to grow. However, at this moment, he suddenly thought of a possibility. His expression changed slightly. Should we change what we do next? Luo Fan looked at the creator doubtfully and asked, Why do you think so, fellow Taoist? The creator replied, The world will has already compromised with fellow Taoist. Next, when we activate the wills of the other world founders, it might not appear again. If it doesn't appear, the other world founders might not trust fellow Taoist as much as I do. His words were rather realistic. Every creator of the world was confident in themselves. Even he was the same. If the will of heaven and earth had not appeared when he was reborn, and had not displayed a terrifying power that he could not resist, and had not made him feel despair, he would never have thought that his strength was not enough, and it was impossible for him to surrender to Luo Fan. Even if Luo Fan had activated his consciousness and was considered his savior, it was the same. At most, he would leave behind a means of communication with Luo Fan, and then he would leave to investigate the will of the world and find a way to resist the will of the world. If he was like that, the other world founders would not be much different. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled. If they don't believe me, so be it. I believe that there will be fellow Taoists who will believe me in the end. I only need those who believe in me. He had naturally thought about the problem that the world founders were worried about, but he did not think it would be much of a problem. After all, most world founders would not stay with him just because he had saved their lives. However, the personalities of world founders were different. There would still be some who would travel with him because he had saved their lives or because of other considerations. Clearly, it was enough for him. Even if it was only a small portion of them, as long as there were enough of them, he would definitely be able to gather enough power to deal with the world will. Furthermore, he believed that such a problem would only arise at the beginning. No matter how confident the world founders were, they could not completely ignore the words of the other world founders. If there were enough world founders following him, and all of them vowed that what Luo Fan said was true, it was very likely that the other world founders would be skeptical. Once they were skeptical and started following Luo Fan for a short period of time, they would soon be able to see the fate of the world founders who did not believe him. Once such an outcome appeared, their doubts would turn into firm belief. Therefore, perhaps the world will would not act in front of him, causing a portion of the founders to leave out of distrust of Luo Fan. However, the number of people who would leave would definitely not be as many as the founders thought. At the very least, it was a ratio that Luo Fan could accept. He naturally did not need to explain such considerations too clearly. Although the world founders were a little confused at the beginning and did not know why Luo Fan was so indifferent about the number of world founders, they quickly grasped Luo Fan's thoughts as they pondered deeply. Perhaps he would not be as clear as Luo Fan about the direction of the final development of the matter, but he already had a vague understanding of it. So that's the case. I understand now. The world founder nodded. Fellow Taoist, do you want to collect the remaining living beings in this world? Luo Fan looked around and asked the world founders. The world founders looked around with a complicated look in their eyes. There were quite a large number of these creatures, and their species were almost identical to those that had been born in the world that he had opened up. This made him feel extremely close to these living beings. It was as if he was looking at his own limbs growing out of his body. However, the birth of these living beings was not under his control. The appearance of these living beings was completely the result of the world will's activation. There were even various powers that belonged to this world among them, as well as other things. It could be said that these living beings were no longer pure. In fact, there were even some schemes of the world will hidden within them. This understanding made him feel extremely repulsed by these living beings. This repulsion and familiarity intertwined, forming his complicated emotions. After a long while, he sighed and made a grabbing motion with his hand. Boundless power surged out from the void, and the countless surviving creatures turned into streams of light and rushed into his sleeve. In the blink of an eye, they were all sucked into his sleeve. At a glance, Luo Fan discovered that there was a world that had just been created in his sleeve. It was a world that completely simulated the environment of the city from before. If the living beings who had been sucked into it were slightly more sensitive, they might not even be able to tell the difference between this world and the city from before. In fact, they might even suspect that the destruction of the city from before was just a figment of their imagination. Evidently, the world founders could not bear to see these living beings die in front of them. Even though these living beings were still alive, they were only alive for now. Once the world founders left, the ruins of the city would lose the suppression of the laws, and the laws would definitely become chaotic. The city was located in the depths of the sea, and it was constantly enduring the pressure and impact of the endless seawater. Once the rules became chaotic, it was inevitable for the city to collapse completely. Once this collapse was discovered, it would be a calamity for the living beings that were still alive. In other words, if the creator of this world didn't care about these living beings, then what awaited these living beings was absolute annihilation. If it was an ordinary world founders, perhaps they would not care about these living beings and leave them to fend for themselves. However, it was clear that the world founders were not that kind of existence. To him, the existence of these living beings was obviously rather important. At the very least, they were very important to him. This could be seen from the fact that when the world founders turned into the laws, they still thought of ways to protect these living beings even when they were enduring the impact and pressure that caused the entire city to tremble violently. Not a single one of the living beings died during the changes. If the other world founders could not even protect themselves, why would they still have the thought to protect those living beings? Faced with this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and did not say anything. In fact, he had already seen through the choice of the world founders. At this moment, his actions were completely within his expectations. However, since he had seen through it and did not say it out loud, he naturally did not need to comment on his actions. He immediately turned around and left the pavilion, heading towards the surface of the sea. As he left the pavilion, the world founders also left the pavilion, and the moment they left, they let out a slight sigh. The instant they left the pavilion, along with the mountain peak, completely collapsed, turning into countless fine powder. With a slight sway, the surrounding seawater became turbid. By the time the seawater became clear again, the mountain peak and the pavilion on top of it had completely disappeared. Evidently, after losing Luo Fan's suppression, the mountain and the pavilion had completely returned to their original state, the state where they were turned into fine powder after being struck by lightning. The state of the powder clearly had nothing to do with each other. Under the washing of the seawater, the powder directly fused with the seawater. Then, as the seawater surged, it dispersed into a large area of seawater. In the end, this place became empty, with nothing related to the mountain remaining. At the same time, the part of the city that had survived was still constantly collapsing and shattering. It looked like some unimaginable power was slowly erasing the traces of the city from the bottom of the sea, or in other words, erasing it from the world. Faced with this situation, the gaze of the world founders became even more complicated. After all, this was a world that was born from him. It contained his worldview, his comprehension of cultivation, the world, the universe, and all things. Now that everything was gradually collapsing and being destroyed behind him, how could he not feel complicated? However, even though he was in a complicated mood, he didn't do anything to stop this from happening. Chapter 2892. Luo Fan brought the heaven and earth creator and quickly rushed out of the sea. Their next target was obviously the next place that simulated the chaotic state of the world. There were countless of such existences in this world. Although this location was not considered too special in this world, there were quite a number of such derivatives. Therefore, they did not have to go far to find several derivatives for them to choose from. That's right, not just one, but several. After all, the derivatives of this world that had fused with other worlds were not arranged in a straight line. Instead, they existed in an almost uniform manner. Under such circumstances, in any location, in any direction, there would obviously be derivatives that could be quickly found. With the previous experiment, the next step was naturally to rely on quantity to win. Therefore, Luo Fan was not picky. After looking at the distribution of the derivatives, he chose a derivative that was not the closest, but was closer to the surrounding derivative. Derivatives could exist in any form in this world. Islands, underwater cities, palaces, clouds, energy, rules, clouds, rules, space, even fragments of time and dimensions. At this moment, the derivative that Luo Fan chose was a cloud that existed in the void. This cluster of clouds was quite wonderful. It seemed to be no different from the other clusters of clouds in this world, but Luo Fan could clearly feel the charm of another world from it. That charm was rather strange. It was a charm that could only be born from a unique worldview. This also meant that the clump of clouds was definitely derived from the worldview of a certain unique creature. If such an existence did not come from another world, and was the work of another world's creator, Luo Fan would not believe it at all. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan only smiled and rushed up with the creator. Not long after, they crashed into the cloud. In just a few days, the cloud suddenly collapsed. Everything that belonged to the cloud completely collapsed and became part of this world. At the same time, a creator rushed out of the cloud and into the distance. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared into the sky. This creator was not the one that Luo Fan had brought out from the underwater city. Instead, it was the creator that Luo Fan had just rescued in the cloud. Obviously, the worries of the underwater city's creator had come true. Because of Luo Fan's existence, the will of the world did not attack the creator. Because the will of the world didn't do anything to him, the creator of the cloud world didn't believe Luo Fan's words. He didn't care about the invisible threat of the will of the world at all. He only did Luo Fan a favor before turning around to enjoy his rare freedom. Faced with such a situation, what else could Luo Fan say? He could only hope that he could live a little longer. After the cloud dissipated, Luo Fan and the creator of the underwater city appeared where the cloud was. Luo Fan's expression was rather calm, but the creator of the underwater city was rather regretful. What a pity! There's nothing to be regretful about. We've already made it very clear. If he doesn't believe us, that's his problem. No one can force him to believe us. Luo Fan said calmly. The creator of the underwater city could only sigh softly. Let's go. We still have a very important mission, Luo Fan instructed before turning around and heading towards another derivative. This time, the derivative was a ball of wind. It was extremely unique. It seemed to be formless, but it had a strong sense of existence. It also had a strong charm that belonged to another world. After a few days, the ball of wind dissipated. Other than Luo Fan and the creator of the underwater city, there was another creator that seemed to be formed from a ball of wind beside them. This was, of course, the original creator of the wind. Completing the rescue of this creator in a few days meant that Luo Fan had a rather deep understanding of this act of rescuing people. Looking at the current situation, it was clear that although the creator of the universe did not completely believe in what Luo Fan had said, he was still somewhat skeptical. Hence, he decided to follow Luo Fan and the others and see how the situation turned out. At this moment, without waiting for Luo Fan to say anything, the creator of the wind suddenly looked into the distance. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled and said, "There's no need to look. That's the will of the world dealing with that person from before." At this moment, in an extremely distant place, an indescribable wave was spreading in all directions. The wave was extremely strange. Despite being so far away, the creator of the wind still felt a kind of pressure from the bottom of his heart, as if he was being targeted by a natural enemy. This feeling was extremely familiar. Back when he lost his self-consciousness, he seemed to have experienced something similar. "Are we not going to save him?" the creator of the cloud world asked. "We can't. Not only is the distance too far, but there must also be some kind of barrier between us that we can't cross for a period of time. Even if we rush over, the matter will already be over," Luo Fan said plainly. He did not confirm this, but he knew that it must be the truth. To the will of the world, the threat that he, Luo Fan, posed to it was real. Of course, it was not a threat to its existence, but a threat to its act of taking away another creator. Hence, to prevent Luo Fan from getting involved, it would definitely make preparations once it acted. It would definitely have sufficient means to prevent him from getting involved before the creator was taken away. Putting everything else aside, the fact that it did not act before and only acted when the creator was so far away was the best proof. It went without saying that the will of the world had a strong desire for the creator of the world. However, even with such a strong desire, it was still able to endure until now. If it wasn't for the sake of making Luo Fan unable to participate as much as possible, it wouldn't make sense. Such a distance was nothing to Luo Fan and the others. If they really wanted to rush over, an instant would be enough. Luo Fan was well aware of this, the other creators were well aware of it, and the will of the world was even more aware of it. Since that was the case, if it still dared to act at such a time and from such a distance, it was clear that it had made full preparations and was confident that it could prevent Luo Fan from getting there in time. Hearing this, the creator of the cloud world fell into deep thought and did not say anything else. At this moment, his trust in Luo Fan's words had increased a little. Of course, it only increased a little. If he wanted the creator to completely trust Luo Fan, this alone was clearly not enough. Of course, Luo Fan did not hope for the creator to completely trust him at this moment. If it was so easy to trust him, then he would not deserve to be called a creator. At this moment, all he needed was for the creator of this world to be skeptical and stay by his side. That was enough. As for the question of complete trust, as long as he went to more places and experienced more things, he would naturally completely trust him. As they spoke, the commotion on the other side completely disappeared. The world returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. From the looks of it, it was obvious that the will of the world had completed its goal and taken away the creator. Luo Fan merely sighed and no longer paid any attention to it. He turned around and led the two creators to another derivative. This derivative was a mysterious spacetime hidden in the depths of the void. Similarly, in just a few days, that mysterious spacetime was annihilated once again. A creator left that mysterious spacetime and headed into the distance alone. This was clearly the original creator of that mysterious spacetime. He clearly did not believe Luo Fan's words, even with the two founders of the world testifying at the side. After he left, Luo Fan and the other two walked out of the void. This time, Luo Fan did not even have the interest to sigh with emotion. He directly led the other two to another derivative. Just like this, Luo Fan's team grew stronger and stronger over the next few years. Unknowingly, there were already hundreds of creators following him. Of course, at the same time, the number of world creators that left him was also not small. Although not all creators were extremely resolute and would not believe it unless they saw it with their own eyes or experienced it for themselves, the majority of creators were clearly more resolute than ordinary living beings. Under such circumstances, they would obviously have doubts about the words of Luo Fan and the other founders of the world. The only difference was how much they doubted it. The few that doubted it followed Luo Fan, intending to see what happened to the other creators. The few that doubted it would directly turn around and leave. At most, they would do Luo Fan a favor and explore the secrets of this world. In the past few years, the number of creators that left Luo Fan's team was probably more than 100. On the whole, it was equal to the number of creators that followed Luo Fan. Apart from the creators that joined Luo Fan's team later on, the other creators' doubts towards Luo Fan had completely disappeared. After all, they were by Luo Fan's side, and from time to time, they could sense the movements of the world's willpower that had left. If it happened once, they would still be somewhat doubtful, thinking that the world's creators were courting death. If it happened twice, that would be fine. Perhaps the world was just that dangerous, and a creator could accidentally touch some sort of taboo. If it happened 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, or even 100 times, then even the thickest of creators would not be able to deceive themselves that it was just a coincidence. Therefore, the longer a creator followed Luo Fan, the more they believed in Luo Fan. In contrast, the pioneers who followed Luo Fan later on were different. Although they had seen the movements caused by the world's will, there were still relatively few of them. With such a small number, it was difficult for them to be completely convinced. Therefore, there would naturally be doubts remaining. Perhaps we can try a stronger challenge. On this day, Luo Fan smiled at the other creators. Hearing this, the other creators were slightly taken aback. A stronger challenge? Was going against the world's will not the most difficult challenge? I'd like to hear the details. As the most experienced creator, the creator of the underwater city joined in the fun and asked, "Don't you think that island is very different from the others?" Luo Fan smiled and pointed at a huge island in the distance. The creators were slightly taken aback. They had encountered quite a number of derivatives over the years, and the derivatives that existed in the form of islands could be said to be the most common. Under such circumstances, the number of islands they had visited was naturally quite a lot. Compared to the islands they had walked through before, apart from being slightly bigger, what was so special about this island? Luo Fan looked at the expressions of the other heaven and earth founders and knew that they did not see anything. However, he was not interested in explaining it to them. After all, as long as they entered, they would definitely be able to feel that the island was different from the previous islands. Immediately, he led the many creators towards the island. Along the way, they passed by a few derivatives, but they did not stop to release the world creator among the derivative. Very soon, they arrived on the island. The size of the island had reached an unimaginable level. From the outside, it seemed to be just a slightly larger island. However, when one looked down from above, they would find that even if they combined all the worlds that they had opened up, they would not be able to compare to this island. It's so vast now. How vast is this world? How powerful must the existence that created this world be? At this moment, similar thoughts flashed through the minds of many creators. Chapter 2893. Any world that entered this world would inevitably shrink. This was not because this world wanted to suppress other worlds, but because this world had requirements for the essence and power of other worlds. Essence and power that did not meet the requirements would be eliminated in the process of fusing with this world. As a result, the essence and power of other worlds that entered this world would naturally be much smaller than before. Generally, the greater the difference between a world's requirements and this world's, the more it would shrink after entering this world. This was something that the founders of this world had already confirmed after seeing many worlds. If it was like that for other worlds, then the world in front of them should be the same. However, even though the world in front of them had shrunk a lot, it was still so huge and vast in the end. How could the founders not be shocked by its original size? Compared to this world, our world is perhaps hundreds of millions of times smaller. This was the judgment that appeared in the hearts of the many founders. With this judgment, their expressions became even more solemn. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't care about the shock in the hearts of the world founders. He just led them into another island. It looked like an island from the outside, but after passing through the invisible boundary, it was as if they had entered a completely independent world. This world was extremely perfect. There were continents, oceans, mountains, rivers, hills, forests, grasslands, deserts, snowy mountains, seas of fire, and all sorts of other sceneries that could be found in any other world could be found in this world. In such a world, there were also innumerable living beings. There were all sorts of different kinds of living beings, and they were different from the beauty standards of the many founders. However, they all vaguely followed some indescribable principle, showing an indescribable beauty of balance. At once, many of the world's founders recognized what kind of creature the born Taoism aptitude in this world was. Once they recognized it, they were naturally able to determine what the founder of this world looked like. That image was also very different from their beauty standards. If it was taken out alone, they wouldn't think that it was a perfect image. However, at this time, this image had the perfect charm of a normal-born Taoism aptitude. It was full of the charm that only born Taoism aptitude had, which any creator of the world would admit. It's like there's a feeling of perfection, just like. One of the founders suddenly murmured, glancing at Luo Fan out of the corner of his eye. Indeed, the appearance of this born Taoism aptitude, compared to the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude of other worlds, had a more subtle feeling, and that was the feeling of perfection. This was also the biggest difference between Luo Fan and the other founders of the universe, apart from the power and might of his body. On Luo Fan's body, there was also that indescribable feeling of perfection. His words caused many of the world founders to be slightly stunned. Then, they all looked at Luo Fan thoughtfully. Evidently, with this reminder, many of the founders of this world had realized why the natural Tao physique in this world seemed to have something familiar to them. It was clearly the special charm of perfection that only Luo Fan had. As expected, it's still there. At this time, Luo Fan said this. With a light stride, he had already brought the many founders across an endless distance, directly arriving at a seemingly ordinary corner of this world. A figure of the born Taoism aptitude of this world instantly appeared in front of them. This figure seemed to be just an ordinary living being, without the slightest bit of extraordinary or mysterious. However, at this moment, when he saw the many founders of the universe, he was only slightly stunned, before smiling bitterly. He did not show the slightest bit of panic and fear that ordinary living beings would have when they saw the world founders. He looked like a person who opened his door and saw his neighbor outside, intending to knock on his door. The existence sighed and asked Luo Fan, "Are you guys here to kill me?" This existence was, of course, the creator of this world. However, he clearly could not confirm the identities of Luo Fan and the others. At this time, he only regarded them as the culprits who had caused him to be in such a predicament. Since he had identified them as the culprits, when they appeared in front of him, he would naturally think that these culprits were here to deal with him, who had originally escaped the net, There was no problem with this logic at all. Hearing this, the other world founders were all stunned. Evidently, they did not expect that there would be a day when they would be regarded as the culprits. Why do you say that, fellow? We're here to seek your help. Luo Fan only smiled at this time. At this time, he understood the thoughts of the world founders. After all, as the first outsider to appear in this world after he entered, it was very normal for him to be regarded as the culprit. Help? You want me to give up my life to help you? The world founders smiled bitterly again. Did this not make sense? At this moment, Luo Fan only shook his head. He knew that if he continued to speak, perhaps he would be able to make the world founders believe him. However, that would waste too much time and too much saliva. It was better to directly save the world founders and let them regain the power that they were supposed to have before anything else. Once they regained the power that they were supposed to have, they would not need to say anything for the world founders to completely believe them. As such, with a slight thought, he sent a thought to the other pioneers of the world. In an instant, the other world founders understood his thoughts. Waves of mysterious power were released from their bodies, and under Luo Fan's guidance, they charged towards the laws of this world. At this moment, the laws of this world distorted violently. The entire world, or rather, the entire island, underwent an earth-shattering change due to this distortion. An unimaginably terrifying pressure appeared out of nowhere and directly pressed down on the world founders. The world founders felt as if thousands of arrows had pierced through his heart, and he felt as if his life was about to be completely lost in the next moment. An incomparably intense fear was born in the depths of his body at this moment. "You're still denying it?" he roared in his heart, and his entire body completely collapsed in the void. At the same time, an indescribable willpower was born in the depths of the laws of this world. The moment this spirit will appeared, it took control of one of the laws. Following that, this control began to rapidly spread to other laws and other nomological laws. In just the blink of an eye, it had completely taken control of the laws of this world. As the laws of this world were completely controlled, the willpower instantly obtained supreme power. It directly unleashed an unimaginably terrifying might that swept through the entire world like a hurricane. At this moment, the world shook violently, as if the entire world had instantly come to life. It's much simpler than before. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed and stopped guiding the various powers, allowing the powers produced by the world founders to quickly retract. In the blink of an eye, they completely disappeared without a trace, no longer affecting the outside world. Facing this change, the willpower paused for a moment. Then, all the changes calmed down. A figure appeared out of nowhere in the void, not far away from Luo Fan and the others. It was the figure of the creator of the world from before. However, compared to before, he no longer had the appearance of an ordinary mortal. Right now, he was already extremely powerful. In fact, he was even more powerful than many of the cultivators who had established the world here. Just by standing there and exuding his aura, he already seemed to be able to control space-time and dimensions. "Fellow Taoist, do you believe me now?" Luo Fan asked. The world founder was slightly stunned, then smiled bitterly. His aura gradually retracted, and in the blink of an eye, it completely disappeared, as if he had never appeared. At this moment, his entire body was filled with an indescribable charm of perfection. Hovering there, he had an indescribable bearing. However, he had already completely recovered the power and strength that the creator of the world should have. "Looks like fellow Taoists are only a step ahead of me?" The world founder sighed at Luo Fan. "We are a step ahead of you, but fellow Taoist Luo Fan isn't. He's the savior of all of us. Now, he's our protector," one of the world founders said with a sigh. "Protector? Could it be because of perfection as well?" The world founder carefully looked at Luo Fan with a bewildered expression. The reason why this world was so special, the reason why it could form such a vast island in this world, and the reason why the creator of this world didn't completely lose his self-consciousness like the other creators and turn into some special existence of rules in this world was actually very simple. But it was only because this world was also a perfect world. That's right, this was a world similar to the perfect world from before. It had already gone through 7 great tribulations and reached the limit that the simulated chaotic state could endure. In the end, it was bestowed with the simulated chaotic state and became a perfect world. This proved the conjecture of the other creator of the perfect world. His own perfect world was clearly not the only perfect world in the simulated chaotic state. In addition to his perfect world, there were many more perfect worlds. As a world that had been bestowed with the simulated chaotic state and reached the highest level that the simulated chaotic state could endure, it naturally had its own special features. It was a great world formed by the tribulation level. For this perfect world, it could not be crushed and destroyed at will like it did with other worlds. Perhaps this world would be able to devour a perfect world, assimilate it, or even completely suppress the creator of this world. However, it was impossible to directly break it down and turn the creator of the world into some sort of law, just like how it was faced with other worlds. After all, no matter what, this perfect world was an existence that had been acknowledged by the simulated chaotic state. Even if this world was formed by the tribulation level and was under the control of the existence that was suspected to be the embodiment of the simulated chaotic state, it could not directly overturn the original decision of the simulated chaotic state and directly deny the recognition, gifts, and rewards of the simulated chaotic state. Therefore, the final result was that this perfect world turned into an island in this world without any reservations, just like the perfect world that Luo Fan had opened up previously. As the founder of this perfect world, the world founder in front of him did not end up in the predicament of the other world founders. Even though he was almost completely suppressed, he still maintained the integrity of his consciousness. Before this, the creator of the perfect world did not know the reason for all of this. However, as his potential was stimulated by Luo Fan and the others through ingenious means and he regained his power and strength, he naturally understood many things that he did not understand in the past. He knew what he had been wasting all this while. That was why he made such a judgment. Although it's not complete, that's what I mean, Luo Fan said at this moment. In that case, what about the enemy? The world founder asked with a solemn expression. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled and did not hide anything. He explained the situation that they were facing to the world founder. Hearing this explanation, the world founder showed an inexplicable look of anger on his face. The will of the heavens. Then let me see how much confidence he has. He muttered. Obviously, he believed in Luo Fan's judgment, unlike the other world founders who were only skeptical about it like Luo Fan. However, what was more obvious was that he did not think that he needed to rely on Luo Fan to resist the will of the world.